All right, just checking if this sounds all right. It does. Does it sound good? I think it does. Alrighty then. Hi. I'm I'm very nervous. I'm extremely nervous right now. Oh, because I'm letting more people know about this. My little secret, my little stream. So, mm, we are gonna go. We are gonna do this, and we are gonna see how it goes. I've been announcing it a bunch. No one I know is streaming, so let's just hope. Let's just hope and pray, like anyone like comes by. So yeah, if you notice anything different, I have a new background. I really like it because it kind of looks like my room. So we are gonna use this, and I'm just gonna put this like this maybe, so I can see chat. Uh, so yeah, we are gonna be reading In Another Life by, give me a second while I see the name, Little Lux Ray, over on AO3. I'm gonna put the link over here if someone wants to like see it. Yeah, we're gonna be reading that, and we're gonna have a great fantastic time. Just for some context, we're gonna read the fandom is Haikyuu, obviously, definitely. The relationship is between Akaashi, Keiji, and Bokuto Kotaro. Characters from mm, Urodani in Haikyuu. And obviously the characters are gonna be in the fanfic are Akashi, Bokuto, Kenma, and Kuro. Uh, Kenma and Kuro are from Nekoma. The additional tags, those are gonna be great fun. Angst, Fluff and Angst, Alternate Universe Hospital, Bokuaka Freeform. I'm sorry I wrote this. I'm sorry. Hurt Comfort, Emotional Hurt slash Comfort, Haikyuu Freeform, Hospitals, I Am Weak, Cloud Atlas References, and Little Lux Ray. This was published in 2015. Can you guys believe it was 2015 when this was announced, when this was published, and that's just incredible to me. Like I remember, like the Haikyuu fandom had like the boom when it came out, but well, no, it started when the anime came out, obviously, but it did have its boom. I think it was around the second season. So yeah, that's that. Uh, not the sad fanfic. It's gonna hurt. Hi Scully. It's gonna hurt. I've already read it, but I thought it was gonna be a good one because it still hurts. So I hope you guys enjoy it. I'm gonna read the summary. Hmm. Sleeping didn't come as easy as it used to. Bokuto knew this, and now Akashi did too. The hospital AU that nobody asked for, but that I took upon myself to write. How much pain scale 1 to 10? It's a mild 8, I'd say. Depending, I mean, like, it really depends. It hurt me a lot. It was like, for me, it was like a 9. But, like, objectively, I think it's like 8. Also, it's relating to hospitals, so if you've been through like a similar situation, I think it's gonna hurt more. So it's a heavy hitter. It's definitely a heavy hitter. So the notes. The first notes are: I never thought I would end up finishing this piece, but I am glad I did. This includes Bokuto and Akaashi, as you may already know. They are my favorite ship in Haikyuu, so typing this makes little to no sense to me. I cried several times while typing it, actually. I am weak. Yeah, so even the author knows it's a sad fanfic. They know. And this fanfic was very popular. I still think it is. Like it wouldn't surprise me for like people that are just joining the Haikyuu fandom. It's like one of those referentials, one of those fanfics you have to know because it's culture. But yeah, are we ready? Are we ready to start this wonderful experience? This pain um train we are gonna get into. I don't think I am ready, but I'm just I think I'll just want to get over it. So yeah. Okay, yeah, Mike sounds good. I think we are ready to start. Are you ready, Skelly? I don't know if I should do like the reading voice, but we'll see. We'll see when we start. We also we should do like recaps, not recaps, like opinions at the end of each chapter. I'll tell you when each chapter ends. We can like discuss it a little bit, and then we'll move on. I don't know how many chapters it is. Oh, it's just one chapter, so we are just gonna have to go through this like quick. If it isn't like an hour stream, then I'll play some Minecraft parkour then. But yeah, okay. I should have brought water. Anyway, we shall be starting now. Hello! Hello, my name is Celestia Ludenberg. Do you like Haikyuu? No, your name is referencing Danganronpa, so yeah. Do you like anime? Welcome, welcome. I'm gonna be reading In Another Life by Little Lux Ray over on AO3. You can see the link if you want to read along. But yeah, I'm gonna start now. We're gonna take some breaks and discuss if anything like pops out and you want to talk about it, then we can pause. But yeah. Had been some time since Akashi set foot into that hospital. It was a dreary place for him, a place that he was not fond of, but a place that he was obligated to visit. Akashi's parents were intent on having him intern in a hospital nearby so that he could stockpile more things that would look good on his resume for future purposes. Oftentimes, however, Akashi would disagree with his parents, unhappy with the suggestions they'd given him, but ultimately they would urge him to carry out the task that had been pushed on him, and one way or another he'd do it. Asking around here and there, the male put little to no effort in finding out where he could go sign up for what. He didn't care, nor he didn't think that he would care in the near future. Akashi was unhappy with where he was, unhappy with what it was that he was doing. He was wasting time, asking for something that he did not want in the least. Pointing a finger down the hall, a small assistant nurse directed Akashi to a different desk, one where he would be able to find more information on the subject. Blatantly, he thanked her and continued on his way, passing by several rooms as he did so. His eyes were set forward. He didn't look into any of the rooms. He didn't want to. It would hurt if he did. Apache closed his eyes and sighed, swaying absent-mindedly in his step, opening his eyes just in time to swiftly avoid colliding with someone. A doctor. No, just another person. He circled around the male, apologizing flatly before he continued on. And it's all right, could be heard from behind him. But as soon as it faded, Akashi continued forward. Do I really want to do this? His eyes stared forward, uninterested in the information desk several meters from him. No, I really don't. Standing still, Akashi remained in place for quite some time, his legs refusing to carry him further. People walked by him, around him, and up and down the halls, to and fro, but no one seemed to notice him. He stood there, hesitant, uninterested, indifferent, unfeeling. He remained in place silently. No one was bothered by him. So there he stood. He brought a hand up to push through his black hair, and slowly his head fell forward. Akashi stared at his shoes. What am I doing? The thought rattled his mind. Why am I even here? Another person walked by at a gradual pace at first, then slowed progressively as they drew near. Their walking then slowed to a halt, and it was then that Akashi had become aware of the new individual who had invaded his personal space. From his peripheral, Akashi could see their hand reaching out to him. He withdrew and looked up. Oh, you can move. He smiled in Akashi's direction, bright yellow eyes catching his own. It had been the same guide he'd almost bumped into. Perhaps he'd remained in the hall and watched as Akashi had gone from a brisk walk to a sudden stop. He understood how that would be alarming to some people. Is there something wrong with me standing here? Akashi asked sincerely. No, I don't think so. He brought his hand down to his side. Why did you stop so suddenly? Are you all right? I'm fine. I was just thinking. Akashi blinked slowly. Of what? A question asker. How thrilling. Of this hospital. I've realized that I don't want to come here anymore. The male who stood across from Akashi shifted his weight to one leg. Were you sick? Are you checking out? Akashi stared through the stranger. No, I'm not sick, but this place makes me feel like I am. His answer was cold, but it did not seem to cut through the other's pleasant mood. I feel the same about this place, honestly. He paused. So, you must be leaving soon then. Yeah, Akashi shifted, leaning in the direction of where he'd come from. He had no interest in staying where he was. His only intention was leaving. He figured he would tell his parents that the people in the hospital were too occupied with everything else to tend to him. He started on his way out without so much as a second glance in the other's direction. Goodbye. Hey, hey! Apache turned his head. What? What's your name? Why did he want to know his name? When would he ever use it again? The stranger could have been a patient at the hospital for all Akashi knew. And that's the last thing he needed, a sickly acquaintance to add to his already short list of friends. You don't need to know. The male across from him did well in hiding the look of offense that almost surfaced upon his face. I understand, but for what it's worth, my name is Bokuto. Akashi cast a weary look in Bokuto's direction, gave a nod, and continued on his way until he was out of the building. Okay, first part, we're gonna have a small break here. That was the introduction. I don't know, is the reading all right? All right. Hmm. Let's see. All right. 2 weeks had passed since Akashi's last visit, and to his dismay, he found himself on the same aimless path back to the same dreaded hospital. He couldn't stand his parents' persistent natures, but he was somewhat relieved to be out of the house, to say the least. Here we go again. Akashi entered the building and greeted the woman at the front desk, as always. He wasted no time ascending the steps needed to get to the part of the hospital where he'd almost reached all that time ago. In minutes, the information desk was in his sights, and for the first time in forever, he'd actually gone to it. He spoke with a small woman there, and after several minutes had passed, Akashi backed away from the desk, some sheets of paper in hand. He stared down the hall, sigh, sighing heavy, heavily, intent on rushing home. Hey, hey, it's you! The familiar voice made Akashi's throat tighten. Another sigh was forced out, even heavier this time. He turned around. Bokuto. Akari-kun! He grinned from ear to ear. Don't call me that. Akashi stuffed the sheets into his bag. I thought you said you were ever going to set foot in here again. There was something strange about the excitement in his tone. He didn't exactly say that, but it was implied. Akashi squinted. Yes, it was implied. Bokuto's face never left his face, and his tired eyelids contradicted his facial expression. Why must I always run into the strange ones? So what brings you here again? I could ask you the same thing. Akashi's lips screwed to the side. Thick white eyebrows raised above jello hues. I'm supposed to be here, actually. Akashi yawned. Intern? No, patient. His smile was unnerving. Silently, the dark-haired male frowned. Oh, I've been insensitive. A laugh bubbled from out of Bokuto. No, you haven't. Don't worry about it. Though he'd been dressed in normal, casual clothing, upon further examination, there was indeed something sickly about him. He was paler than the others who walked along the halls, and soft, dark circles sat under his eyes. Akashi made sure not to stare. I know you aren't going to ask, so I'll just let you know. From what I've heard, the doctor said that whatever I have is called FFA? Bokuto folded his arms. He held an air around him, as if he were having a normal conversation about the weather. Familial insomnia, if I remember correctly. A cold shiver curled up Akashi's spine. He'd never heard of that disease before. It worried him enough to get some words out of him. I don't think I want to ask about the symptoms of this illness. Well, even if you wanted to, I wouldn't have an answer for you. Another laugh. All I can say is that sleeping doesn't come as easily as it used to. What normally would have pained someone to say, he delivered with ease, and with that same grin to boot. Akashi couldn't help but almost smile back, his lips barely twitching. He stared in Bokuto's direction, at him this time. Are you here every day? Of course. I've been here for about 4 weeks now. He blinked sluggishly. I see. Akashi nodded once. No words were exchanged for a moment, and soon the short amount of silence had become awkward. Well, I'll be going now. Shut him out. Don't let him in. He's sick. 1 second. Akashi's jaw clenched. I have to go, Bokuto. He started on his way. Please don't persist. If you would listen, please. His hands at his sides, Bokuto bowed. Please, it will only take 1 second. Akashi was straightforward, but he wasn't heartless. He huffed out a breath and turned around. What is it? I really have to go. His eyes lighting up, Bokuto straightened his back and fished his hand out into his pocket. He pulled out a phone, and, to Akashi's dread, he asked for his phone number. What was he to do? What was he to say? Akashi literally found nothing special about Bokuto. Why had this sickly one taken a sudden liking to him? He wanted nothing more than to push him away, throw away the forms, and never set foot into that hospital again. But for some strange and irritating reason, Akashi found it difficult to deny Bokuto. He was trying to, he truly was, but he just couldn't. I don't usually text, Akashi murmured. He looked down at Bokuto's phone. He couldn't look at his face. I'm often busy. Keeping in contact with me Keeping in contact with me wouldn't be a good idea. He watched Bokuto's fingers curl around the phone, and his hand slowly backed away. But Akashi shocked himself with that one word. He could still see Bokuto's hand, and it had frozen in place. I guess I could find some time to talk to you every so often. He looked up, and his gaze found Bokuto's. Those yellow eyes were gleaming. He entered his number swiftly, and then handed the phone to Bokuto, the name section empty. Thank you! His voice was full with excitement as he proceeded to enter the name for his new contact. Akashi watched closely as Bokuto mouthed and typed the name. Apathy-kun. Bokuto was close to saving the contact before Akashi spoke up. You don't have to put that, he sighed. It's Akashi. The sky burned a strong orange glow as the sun set in the distance. Akashi sat in bed, laptop in his lap, as his fingers scrolled and typed frantically. FFI. The page loaded. Akashi went straight into the reading. FFI is it's a very rare autosomal dominant inherited prion disease of the brain. Akashi's eyes scanned the screen. FFI has no known cure and involves progressively worsening insomnia, which leads to hallucinations, delirium, and confusional states like that of dementia. Thin lips pressed into an ever thinner line. His fingers remained stiff for quite some time as his eyes read in the introductory paragraph over and over again. There's no known cure, huh? Akashi continued to read on. All the people who've contacted this disease eventually die within a year or less. This part was read out loud. He rubbed his face quietly. Of course they do. Akashi leaned his head on his hand, chin resting in his palm. I wonder if Bokuto knows all of this. He must have looked it up at some point, right? It was the only normal thing to do, considering how he was the one who was suffering from said disease. Insomnia. He thought back to the bags around Bokuto's eyes. All I can say is that sleeping doesn't come as easily as it used to. Akashi exhaled quickly through his nose, making a sound that was almost like a laugh. He, he read up on the symptoms and blinked gently, a hand over his lips. After several minutes, Akashi closed his laptop and lay back on his bed. He stared at the ceiling. Some friend I've made. There wasn't much more else to say. New text message from Bokuto, sent July 29th at 11:56 p.m. Hey, I hope this isn't a bad time. Akashi lifted his head from his pillow and reached a hand out to grab his phone. The bright light caused him to squint as he read the message. Quietly, he contemplated on whether he wanted to respond or not. He blinked weakly and slid his fingers down the sides of his phone, a sign of weariness that he could not disobey. Takashi watched as the screen went to black, and it was then that he placed the phone back on his nightstand, choosing to ignore the message. He couldn't fall asleep for about an hour after the text, but ultimately slipped off to sleep. Akashi never received another message in the remaining hour he was awake. During the next day, Akashi decided to stay home. He sat in his room for the majority of the day and had spent at least 6 hours awake until he'd pick his phone up in his hands again. He looked at the message Bokuto had sent him the night before. His thumb aimlessly hovered over the keyboard, thinking of what to type. From Akashi, sent at 4:43 p.m. Hello, Bokuto. Hey, hey, hey! I must have texted you while you were asleep. Akashi was dumbfounded. He'd never received a faster response in his life. Akashi. Yeah, that must have been the case. You say hey a lot, Bokuto. Bokuto. I know, it's kind of my thing. Akashi could feel Bokuto's enthusiasm through his text message. He spoke to Akashi as if he hadn't had a friend to text in years. Bokuto. How are you today? Akashi. I'm well. Thank you. Just catching up on some volleyball things. Bokuto. Volleyball? You like volleyball too? We have to play together. Wincing a bit, Akashi squinted at his phone screen. Such an energetic texter Bokuto was. He was kind of difficult to keep up with. Akashi felt like this would be a long-term sort of thing. Akashi. Uh, sure. I mean, will they let you out of the hospital? Bokuto. I guess. I can still walk around and get to where I have to go. Pretty much the only thing wrong with me is that I can't sleep. Akashi scowled. He could have felt the ignorance emanating of Bokuto's text messages. Did he really think he was admitted to a hospital just because he was having trouble sleeping? He knew full well the name of the disease he had. So Then why was he so cheerful about his entire situation? Why did he lack the understanding of just how serious his condition was? Unless Bokuto was purposely playing the fool. He must have been, right? Akashi's grip tightened around his phone. He had to be. Akashi. Then I guess I'll see you at the hospital around a week or two from now. I know a gymnasium we can go to. Bokuto. A week or two? Akashi. Is that too long of a wait? I can probably reschedule. Bokuto. Nah, it's alright. I guess I can wait that long. I've got time. I've got time. The words echoed in Akashi's head, as if they'd been spoken aloud. He stared down the screen, his brow furrowing slightly. Did Bokuto know about the lifespan of victims with his condition? Was he just playing the fool after all? Just what kind of guy was he? Indifference morphed into curiosity, and said curiosity was what drew Akashi closer to his new friend. Akashi, great. I'll see you then. Akashi! Another 2 weeks had passed since Akashi had seen Bokuto, but this time he waited outside of the hospital, several meters away from the entrance. Akashi had looked up from his phone and stuffed it into his jacket pocket as the energetic hospital patient made his way across the lot. In no time, Bokuto was standing in front of Akashi, eager in every way to make it to the gymnasium. I haven't set foot outside in weeks. He looked around. The day was strangely chilly, with an occasional breeze now and then, causing the browning leaves to rustle in the trees above. Those yellow eyes examined everything, adamant with taking all of it in. Bokuto tucked his hands into the pockets of his hood, his shoulders hunching. A puff of smoke came from him as he exhaled. He was paler than before, and the bags under his eyes were darker. Bokuto looked exhausted beyond belief. Yet there he stood, excited to make his way into the gymnasium. Akashi hadn't even mustered his first words before Bokuto snapped his head to the side to give him his undivided attention. The gym's about 10 minutes that way. Akashi pointed down the road. Then let's go! Bokuto power walked ahead, obligating Akashi to catch up with him with a quickened pace, whether he wanted to or not. Hey, water break. I like the forming of the relationship they have here. Give me a second, I'm just gonna turn this to here so it sounds better. So the guy moves a little bit more. Alrighty, then. Water break. How are we feeling about this? Do we like it? Do we not like it? Is it interesting? We could also choose another fanfic if we wanted to. I have another Bokuaka one and then Avatar the Last Airbender. That's like a self insert YN fanfic, so I don't know if we really want to go there. But yeah, water break. Give me a second. Hmm. The sound of their sneakers squeaking against the gym floor was so memory inducing. It caused Takashi to take a moment and reminisce on the old days, as if doing so would take him back in time to when he'd play volleyball every single day after school. After a while, he opened his eyes and sighed, then moved across the court to the net. He brought along a volleyball of his own, just in case they weren't provided with any. What used to be your position back when you would play? Bokuto asked aloud, finally putting his hands from his finally pulling his hands from his hood pockets. His head was cocked back as he surveyed the gym. Akashi bounced the ball off the floor twice. Setter, you. Bokuto grinned. I was the captain and the ace. He gave a mock swing of his arms, as if spiking. Do you think you can toss to me? Of course. Akashi and Bokuto carried a sort of unspoken communication with each other. They had a strange relationship, to say the least. Akashi would answer his questions coldly, with little to no emotion, but Bokuto would cherish these answers and retort with excitement in his tone. He did not seem to take offense easily. Bokuto was very different from everyone else Akashi had ever met before him. Where most people would detach themselves, Bokuto would hold and wouldn't let go, being as persistent as he was energetic. It was very unsettling. Akashi turned away and frowned. I wouldn't have given you my number if you weren't patient. The black-haired male bounced the ball again and walked over to position. This is all so nostalgic. Bokuto's voice was filled to the brim with excitement. He took several steps back to prepare himself for the toss. Mentally, he was more than ready to spike, but not so much physically. Mhm. Bokuto missed Takashi's set 12 times. Shit, shit! His frustration was unmasked. Please toss to me again. He threw the ball to Akashi. There's no stopping you, is there? Taking the ball into his hands, Akashi aimed for the approximate location as to where Bokuto would spike the ball. He wanted him he wanted for him to spike it at least once, lest Bokuto threw a self-hate induced panic attack. Watching as Bokuto ran forward, Akachi set the ball perfectly. It brought him back to his high school days. Now, if only the sickly one would hit it. The sound of the palm of Bokuto's hand meeting the ball sounded so much like an explosion. Akashi flinched. It had been so long since he'd heard something so loud. It was amazing. Ha! Did you see that? Bokuto was bursting with emotion. He was ecstatic. I spiked it perfectly just now. That toss was perfect. Without hesitation, he ran across the court to retrieve the ball. Akashi knew that running probably wasn't the best thing that he should have been doing, but he said nothing about it. The ball was tossed back to him, and again, he got back to tossing the ball for Bokuto. After 3 sets, there was another hit, and another cheer from the former ace. Akashi raised his eyebrows. Impressive. He watched the ball roll further away from them, and expected to see Bokuto trailing it, but instead saw nothing. He turned his attention back to the only other in the room. Mhm. Bokuto stared off in the distance from beyond the net, his face carrying a confused expression. After a moment, quietly, he spoke. They aren't really there, are they? The words left his mouth reluctantly. Akashi glanced in the direction of where Bokuto was staring. No one. They were the only two in the gym. He dug his thumbnail into the side of his index finger and returned his gaze to Bokuto. They aren't really there. He had to force himself to say the mere four words. Bokuto mouthed an okay, and backing up several steps. Could you please toss to me some more? Sure. Akashi nodded, and that was all that Bokuto needed to hear before he ran off to retrieve the ball. Ugh, it's difficult to read. The words are just merging into each other, and now I'm very, very confused. Give me a second. Maybe like this. Hmm. At some point during their walk home from the gym, Akashi had agreed for Bokuto to spend the night at his house. My parents are out for a month, he'd unconsciously said, causing Bokuto to go into a begging frenzy to stay over until Akashi said yes. Normally, he would have been red with irritation from the sound of such irksome persistence, but the smile that would claim Bokuto's face whenever he agreed to do something would make Akashi forget all about how frustrated he was. He entered his home with Bokuto in a matter of minutes, having walked faster than usual. Out there, the sickly one trembled like a newborn animal, even with the extra jacket that Akashi had offered him. It's warm. Bokuto exhaled and shuddered once he was inside, slipping off his shoes. Akashi stepped in and turned his head. I would hope so. He moved he moved forward. My room is this way. Bokuto followed briskly. He observed his surroundings once again, having been fascinated by the inside of someone else's home. Everything was neat and placed perfectly here and there, giving Akashi's house a warm atmosphere to it. It reminded him of his home. Bokuto nearly bumped into Akashi as he stopped to enter his room. You can sit anywhere. He climbed into bed and folded one leg, pulling over his laptop to start it up. Is your bed all right? Bokuto pulled off Akashi's jacket. I said anywhere. Bokuto plopped into the mattress onto the mattress right after those words, bumping his head against Akashi's shoulder. He recoiled with a grunt. Watch it. Akashi shifted to the side to give his visitor more room. Despite this, Bokuto was still close enough for their arms to touch. Akashi sighed and lazily dragged his finger along the D-pad. Do you want to watch a movie? Bokuto curled in on himself and pushed his hands into the hood of his pocket. Yeah, anything is fine. His yellow eyes stared at the screen intently. Okay. Akashi opened the first movie that he had in his computer's memory. He pushed the laptop away and pressed play. What's it called? Confused, Bokuto glanced over at him. Cloud Atlas. How long is it? About 3 hours. He kicked his legs out of bed and walked across his room to retrieve a thick blanket that sat bundled up in a rolling chair. Then he tossed it to Bokuto once he was close enough. You've been shivering, you said. Bokuto gathered the navy blue blanket in his arms, cautiously threw it around his shoulders. It was soft. Thank you. He kept his eyes on the screen. I used to handle the cold better than this. An embarrassed chuckle escaped him. Exhaling through his nostrils, Akashi reclaimed his seat in bed, crossing his legs. Things happen. Yeah. Outside, the sky above grew dark and clouds rolled in. Bokuto quieted himself, curled up, and watched on as the movie started. The sound of Ray The sound of rain paddling hard against the window snapped Akashi back into reality. He looked around in a weary haste, but calmed quickly once his memory had returned to him. He nodded off for a brief moment, with his arms crossed and his head resting on a thick bundle of pillows. With much effort, he sat up to look at Bokuto. The movie was well over 2 hours in, nearing its end, and Bokuto laid on his side, curled up and clutching the blanket with what little strength he had left. His eyes were half lidded and glued to the screen, his face void of emotion. It almost looked as if he it almost looked as if he were asleep. Bokuto? Ikashi's voice was groggy. Slowly, his yellow eyes scrolled to the side to catch Akashi's gaze. He turned his head weakly, and his body along with it. I'm sorry, I watched this movie so many times I actually fell asleep. Akashi dragged a hand. Akashi dragged a hand down his face. Don't be sorry. Bokuto found himself smiling. It's your house. You sleep if you want to. Not if I have a visitor over. It's fine. I'm not just some visitor. After all, we're friends. Bokuto's head lolled to the side, directing his attention back to the movie. You were out for about an hour. Itachi heaved a sigh. He rubbed the back of his neck. I envy you. I wish I could sleep like that again. Guilt bubbled up within Akashi's chest. He'd realized just how rude that was. Falling asleep so easily in front of a person whose biggest struggle was just that. How insensitive of me. He furrowed his brow, mentally scolding himself. Don't cry over it. Bokuto shifted as he lay down, sticking a leg out to kick Akashi. The movie kept me company. It's very good. Kind of confusing, but good. I'll have to watch it again. Strange. Bokuto was such a strange one. He seemed to be unfazed by many things, and blatant about others, blurting sentences out that didn't seem to have much thought behind them. Akashi doubted that he'd ever have Bokuto over again, so hearing him say, I'll have to watch it again, didn't sit too well with him. Akashi twisted his lips to the side and decided to bring up something else. Are you tired? Exhausted, Bokuto answered honestly. Close your eyes for the time being. Akashi kicked his legs out of bed with much effort and stood on his feet. I'll get us some water. He left the room quickly, leaving Bokuto by his lonesome. After several seconds, he returned to see that Bokuto had changed his position in bed entirely. He laid on his back, his head on some of Akashi's pillows. His hands rested on his stomach. The dark blanket surrounded him from behind, but slipping off just enough for his torso to be exposed. His head rested against the bed, slumped to the slumped to the side, facing away from Akashi. Again, if he hadn't known any better, Akashi would have figured that Bokuto was already fast asleep. He approached his bedside silently. The room was dark, apart from the soft orange glow that his lamp gave off. He set the drinks down and shuffled into bed, as if trying not to wake the other. Laying on his back, he stared at the ceiling. No words were exchanged for what seemed like forever before Akashi spoke up. How does it feel to not be able to sleep? Bokuto's answer was delayed. Awful. He turned his head to the opposite direction, facing Akashi now. I can barely keep my eyes open by day, and can barely keep them closed by night. He snorted in laughter. Does it frustrate you? It did at first, when I didn't understand why. But now I'm kind of okay with it. A hand reached up to push through his own messy locks. I still miss it though. Sleeping, dreaming. Akashi watched Bokuto, listening to every word he said. I used to have some insane dreams too, especially certain before especially before certain volleyball matches. He laughed again, louder this time. I dreamed that I'd messed up during a spike and then I wake up fuming and would constantly tell myself that I was the best. Do you still think that you are the best? Emerald eyes searched Bokuto-san for an honest answer. He sighed his response with a grin. Yeah. Bokuto closed his eyes after that. One hand rested on the side of his head. He was obviously tired, showing signs of exhaustion with every small move he made. Akashi grew silent and knitted his fingers together on his stomach, his head relaxing into his pillow. The both of them didn't exchange any words after that, ending the conversation just as suddenly as it had started. 2 hours had passed since their last words were towards each other, yet Akashi still laid awake in bed. Unknown to Bokuto, he watched him quietly through almost closed eyelids, his thick lashes being enough to hide the fact that he was still awake. Tired, but awake. Akashi couldn't sleep, but it wasn't because of his unfamiliarity with Bokuto that caused this. He couldn't sleep because of his honest fascination with him. Bokuto would lay still for quite a while, his head tilted to the side with one hand on his stomach and the other at his side. When he was like this, Akashi would think that he was resting, and he would almost believe that thought until Bokuto would twitch awake again, his body jerking him from what little relaxation he tried to achieve. At first, Akashi thought nothing of it. Bokuto would wince and snap back to reality the same way someone would when they dreamed like they were falling. But Akashi knew full well that such a thing wasn't possible with Bokuto's condition. It made Akashi pity him, to say the least. 3 times Bokuto jolted awake involuntarily, and 3 times he covered his eyes with his forearm and heaved a quiet sigh. Akashi refused to have reacted to those moments, hoping to spare his visitor the embarrassment of him having seen that. He intended on closing his eyes and falling asleep for real afterwards, but after having his mattress shake for the 4th time, he opened his eyes. Akashi lifted himself onto his elbows. He whispered. Alarmed, he snapped around quickly. His face bu- Ah! His face looked both shocked and exhausted at the same time. Akashi, I'm... Don't. His voice was a mere murmur. Akashi moved closer to Bokuto, then resumed to lie down on his back, his head slightly elevated with the pillows that sat behind him. Don't apologize. Mildly embarrassed, Bokuto looked away and rubbed his arms. Come. Akashi beckoned for his visitor. Turning his attention back to him, Bokuto met Akashi's gaze. He wore a confused expression, wondering just what the other had meant by that word. I said come. He motioned for Bokuto to come closer. Get over here. As Akashi said this, he held out an arm, as if readying himself for some sort of hug. Obeying with hesitance, Bokuto shifted towards Akashi and lay against him, fitting into the curve of his arm. It was no doubt that he was larger than Akashi, but that didn't stop him from fitting in just right. Bokuto's head laid against Akashi's shoulder. Akashi's arm cautiously wrapped itself around Bokuto's broad shoulders. Neither of them said a word. Minutes passed, and in that time, Akashi could feel Bokuto relaxing against him, the signs of fatigue finally wearing him down. His head slumped against his shoulder, and both of his hands rested on his stomach. He was trying. He was trying so hard to fit in that small amount of sleep that would get him through the next day. And Akashi wanted to help. As much as he didn't want to believe it, Akashi wanted so badly to help. Why? Akashi was Akashi watched as one of Bokuto's hands twitched involuntarily, and to his dismay, it wouldn't stop. Slowly, he reached a hand out and closed it over the twitching one, his four fingers fitting into Bokuto's palm. In second, in seconds, his hand was calm again. Akashi inhaled quietly. He watched as Bokuto's chest rose and fell with each breath that kept him alive. His breathing was controlled, much like one of a person who was actually asleep. Pursing his lips, Akashi let his head fall back into the pillows. He turned his side he turned his head to the side, towards Bokuto's. He could smell his faint scent. He smelled sort of like a hospital. Hey, small cut over there. I am I am not doing a great job. I am so sorry. I am butchering this, like legit butchering. This is not going as well as I thought it would. I mean, no, it's actually going just as I thought it would. And because I don't know how to read on I don't know how to read out loud. It's a problem, and I don't really know. I don't really know how to read. So I'm gonna have like a small break. We are just gonna chat a little bit, and then we are gonna resume. This is like the first step into their relationship, the small volleyball practice, and then him inviting Bokuto to stay over. And I find that adorable. That's so sweet. And it just shows like Akashi is a very um I guess you'd say a guarded person, and Bokuto is just so free, so carefree, so open, but still like so pained because like the the illness is very very strong. And poor guy, he's just trying his best. He's just trying his best. He's just trying his best, but it's just not possible. So yeah, mm, we're gonna keep on reading. Had a small break. Should probably get some water, but it's okay. It's okay. It's fine. It's fine. We can get through this. We can get through this, right? I hope so. Hmm. Akashi made his way to the hospital for the umpteenth time that week. His hands in his jacket pockets, and his nose burrowing into the burgundy knit scarf that protected him from the chilly weather. It had been 2 months since Bokuto's visit over his home, and ever since then, Akashi found that making his way to the hospital had become a daily routine for him. And even if he didn't show up, he would still spend his days sending messages to Bokuto, be it text, email, or the occasional video chat. Exhaled through his nose and entered the hospital, greeted the woman at the front desk, who now knew him by name, and removed the scarf from around his neck. Akashi already knew where he had to go. Ascended those familiar steps, said hello to the familiar faces, and rounded that familiar corner that he knew would lead him to Bokuto's room. Another breath escaped him, slow and casual, but he'd soon learn to hold his breath when he noticed another person sitting outside in the hall, several feet from the room, where visitors could spend their time. Akashi eyeballed the small male for a long second, knowing that he wouldn't look up to catch him. His head hung low, and his attention belonged only to the handheld system that entertained him. Normally, Akashi would have walked away in that instant in order to pay Bokuto a visit, but as he neared his room, he could hear two voices coming from within. One of the voices belonged to Bokuto, the other he had no clue. Akashi paused and gripped the strap of his pack. Hesitating, he turned, pivoting on one foot to stare back at the small one who sat by his lonesome. Feeling it would be rude to interrupt Bokuto's conversation with whoever was the other person, Akashi strode over to the seats and sat one chair away from the gaming stranger. Akashi tapped his fingers quietly against his pants. Are you here to see Bokuto Kotaro? Akashi asked in a level tone. No, my friend is. The other spoke in a quiet voice, low and brooding. Or maybe not brooding, but more along the lines of apathetic. No, Apathy-kun. The nickname popped into Akashi's head for a brief second. He wasn't too sure why. Is your friend a friend of Bokuto's? Yeah, an old friend. He paused. He pressed pause on his PSP and tapped one end of it against his open palm. They used to play volleyball together. They go back a couple years. Akashi leaned back in his seat. Ah, I see. He felt the need to keep most of his questions at bay. His company did not seem like the type to socialize so openly. So he figured simple inquiries would do just fine, especially if he kept them to a minimum. May I ask your name? Akashi took a shot at it. A small thumb rubbed at the system screen to remove a smudge. He looked up, gazed at Akashi past his bleached blonde bangs, and straightened his back in the slightest way possible. Kosume Kenma. Akashi Keiji. He felt like he could enjoy Kosume's company, what with how his words lacked all form of emotion. It's nice to meet you, Kosume. Kenma is fine. He looked back down at his game screen. Likewise. Akashi nodded, glad to have made an acquaintance, and would have relaxed into his seat if not for the sudden, disembodied voice that startled him soon after Kenma's sentences. As after Kenma's sentence. Hey Kenma, who are you talking to? As if straight from a cartoon. Out popped a tall male from Bokuto's room, with stark black hair that hung over his face and stuck out in all directions. He carried a look on his face that made him seem more sinister than sincere, and his eyes flitted from Kenma to Akashi, then back to Kenma. This is Akashi. I just met him. His words were as straightforward as they were indifferent. Akashi? Bokuto's voice rang from out the room at this time. Akashi didn't Akashi didn't even have to see his face to know Bokuto was beaming. He's here? Is he here? I am. Akashi rose from his seat to enter the room, but instead found Bokuto standing at the door in seconds. His eyes were wide with surprise. He was thinner than before. A large flannel fit, a large flannel shirt fitting him loosely. He had probably lost a bit of over 20 pounds in the 2 months that had passed. Akashi frowned. Get back into bed. You shouldn't be. Akashi didn't allow him to finish his sentence as he embraced Akashi suddenly. I didn't think you were gonna make it today. Though he'd gotten thinner, his arms still had some power to them. He he squeezed Akashi, mashing him closer until he could barely breathe. Akashi's eyebrows knit together. I told you I would. He all but murmured against Bokuto's shoulder. What's this? The taller, dark-haired male gestured to them. I come to visit, and I'm barely paid attention to. But when he comes along, he's given the whole package? Bokuto pulled his face. Bokuto pulled away to face his smirking friend. Relax. Then he turned his attention to Akashi. This is Kuro, a close friend of mine. He cocked his head. He cocked his head to the side. Nice to meet you, Akashi. I've heard a lot about you in that short hour I've been here. Nodding once, Akashi acknowledged Kuro's words, but did not know how to respond to them. All he had to offer was "The pleasure is mine," before moving forward to try and usher Bokuto back into his room. Hey, hey! Bokuto resisted, standing firm in place. We were actually just talking about stepping outside. Well, I brought it up, just as a suggestion. But then he got really excited. Kuro scratched the back of his head. So, we were going to step outside for a minute or two, in order to get this owl to shut up. I've been cooped in this place for too long. I haven't gone outside in days. The discomfort could be heard in Bokuto's voice. If there was one thing that Akashi had learned about Bokuto in the little time that he'd known him, it was that he wasn't too fond of staying locked up indoors. Maybe taking him outside for a while would do him some good. Akashi looked down the hall. Let's go then. The garden's out this way. Everyone came to an unspoken agreement after the one sentence. Kuro started down the hall, Bokuto trailing after him. Akashi followed after, knowing that Kenma was nearby. As he walked, he stared at the backs of the two men in front of him. They both seemed to be the same height, but Akashi couldn't help but realize that Bokuto looked just a bit smaller. A mere 2 minutes outside had turned into 2 hours. Akashi shared a bench with Kenma. The both of them had sat down long ago, leaving Bokuto and Kuro to their own business as they wandered about and waved their arms around in their animated way of speaking. He found it strange how Bokuto was the one walking around when he was the sick one out of the lot. He furrowed his brow and exhaled heavily, his eyes looking down. He stared at his knees intensely before Kenma spoke up. You don't like to see him like that, do you? Akashi lifted his head and looked to his side. He eyed the blonde one for quite a while. Kenma didn't give him a chance to respond. I don't like to see him like that either. It's why I didn't want to come along. But Kuro insisted. Kenma's unconcerned tone contradicted his words, but something told Akashi that he meant everything he was saying. Were you ever friends with Bokuto? Akashi lifted his head in a subtle interest. More like acquaintances. Our teams would face each other often. Whenever we did, Kuro and Bokuto would meet up afterwards and spend time together. I'm usually around Kuro, so he shrugged with little energy. I sort of got to know him through Kuro's company. He's an okay guy. Loud, though. Bokuto's disembodied laughter rang throughout the garden, as if to prove Kenma right. Akashi almost smiled. So, how are you taking all of this, if I may ask? I'm Kenma's lips puckered at puckered in thought. I'm taking it well, or at least I think I am. I'm trying to detach myself. It's another reason why I didn't want to pay Bokuto any visits. He looked down, his hair hanging over his face. There's something about Bokuto that doesn't sit well with me. Confused and mildly shocked, Akashi made a face. Is there something wrong with him? Has he ever done something bad? Not to my knowledge, but even if he has, that's not what I meant. Kenma rubbed his nose with his sleeve. It doesn't matter if you've never met Bokuto before, or if you haven't seen him in 10 days, or 10 weeks, or 10 months, or 10 years. If you ever interact with him, even in the slightest, you'll be reminded of just how good of a person he is. Akashi stared at Kenma, speechless. He's genuine, kind, and at times infantile, but that's what makes him so likable, I suppose. He drags you back in, praises others while shouting that he's the best at everything he does. It's ridiculous. Looking away, Akashi watched as Bokuto and Kuro reappeared in the distance. They were still wrapped up in whatever conversation they were having. Kuro looks happy now, but he wasn't then. Kenma almost murmured hit the words. Akashi turned to catch a glimpse of him, but he stared off into the distance, his eyes not focusing on anything in particular. Blinking, Akashi turned his attention back to Kuro and Bokuto. 5 weeks ago he was in shambles. He didn't want to talk to anyone. He only accepted my company. I was the only one willing to give it to him. He continued to stare as he talked. That was when he learned about the disease. This entire past month hasn't been any different for him, though. He almost didn't want to come in today, either. No one likes to find out that someone they care about is sick, much less diagnosed with a disease that can be cured. Bokuto and Kuro continued to talk animatedly, the both of them out of earshot. Bokuto is starting to look less and less like his old self, too. He used to be thicker. He used to be bigger than Kuro, but now he's the one who's smaller. Kuro's the bigger one. Kuro's the heavier one. It doesn't it doesn't make any sense. Pursing his lips into a thin line, Akashi looked down and noticed that Kenma had laced his fingers together. He pulled and tugged at them restlessly. His hands showed what his face dared not. Akashi figured it was safe to say that Bokuto had already begun to pull Kenma back in. It was an awful thing to do, but Akashi knew full well that none of it was intentional on Bokuto's part. All he had to do was talk to someone, and in an instant they would be involved in Bokuto's lively shenanigans once again. Akashi knew this. The same thing happened to him some 2.5 months ago. If he had known that sending that simple text messages would have turned into daily hospital visits, then he would have never handed over his cell number. This was not what he wanted. He wanted healthy friends that he could talk to on a regular basis, not one sick friend who he'd have to invest personal and emotional time into. Akashi swallowed thickly and crossed his hands, rubbing one thumb over the other. He stared at Bokuto and found it difficult to look away. With a heavy heart, he spoke. I wish I never met him. A cool breeze passed through the garden just then, and in a distance, Bokuto held tightly to the burgundy knit scarf wrapped around his neck to keep him warm. In time, Bokuto and Kenma found that it was time for them to make their way back home. Kuro bid Bokuto farewell, and for the time being, farewell for the time being, while Kenma made his way downstairs to to exit the building. He didn't seem like one to say goodbye, or hello, for that matter, so both Akashi and Bokuto didn't pay any mind to it. Kuro finally left the room after 4 minutes or so, having forgotten that he was supposed to leave in the first place. He waved and jogged out, knowing that if he didn't hurry, he'd have to spend several more minutes trying to catch up to a wandering Kenma. Standing at the side of Bokuto's bed, Akashi glanced to the open door that led to the hallway. Your friend is a lot like you. Anything but, Bokuto retorted, sitting upright in bed. He's a bit more of an ass, to say the least. He chuckled and rubbed his face wearily. Warily. The sound of Bokuto's laughter caused Akashi to turn his head back to him. It was a reaction that Akashi was not expecting in the least, but he played off his surprise and only managed then. I see. Bokuto gazed at Akashi, almost in wonder. Why are you standing? Take a seat. He pat the empty space next to him and immediately. No, it's all right. I was actually thinking of taking my leave soon as well. What? Why? The disappointment in his voice was clear. You've only been here for like 30 minutes. Akashi scratched his head. It's been over 3 hours, actually. That's the same thing! Bokuto moved closer to where Akashi was standing, all the while still sitting in bed. I spoke to Kuro most of the time, so it doesn't count. What doesn't? Akashi took an unnoticeable step back. The 3 hours! He was getting frustrated. I'm very bad at measuring time now, too, if you haven't noticed. 3 hours feel like 7 hours sometimes, but 3 hours can also feel like 7 minutes. I may not be as sharp as I used to, but that whole time flies away when you're having fun rule still applies to me, even today. So, 3 hours is nothing. Akashi muttered. Exactly. Bokuto's eyes lit up again. Akashi avoided looking into them. I understand, but I still have to go. He avoided looking at Bokuto altogether. I would stay if it were up to me. I've just got something to take care of, but I'll be sure to visit you tomorrow. Bokuto didn't make a sound. He pressed his lips into a thin line and fell backwards on his bed. He probably had 1,000 things to say, but he kept them all at bay and instead rolled onto his side, facing away from Akashi. He was shocked. Akashi never knew that Bokuto was one to suddenly sulk on a dime. He looked around and frowned, and figured it would be best to take his leave. I'll see you tomorrow. Do you want your scarf back? The question came out of the blue, despite him being the one who asked. Bokuto held onto it tightly. Akashi watched him and zipped up his jacket. Yeah, I do. In dismay, Bokuto sat up in bed and slowly reached around his neck to pull off the warm piece of cloth. He took his time, the thought of removing it killing him faster than the disease itself. But I also want you to hold onto it. The words had come eh, the words had come as such a shock to Bokuto that he paused and looked up at Akashi. His hands tensed, relaxed, and rested against his neck. You do? Yes. Akashi managed the faintest of smiles. Please hold on to it, Bokuto. At that moment, he turned away and walked off, feeling he wouldn't be able to leave if he lasted one more second in the room. It's so hard. Akashi woke with a s- Akashi woke Akashi woke with a start the same night. His strangled shouts having pulled him from his sleep. He flinched hard and sat up quickly, closing his hand over his mouth to subdue the almost hysteric sounds that came from him. His breathing was heavy, his heart rate quicker than usual. Akashi could feel his heart pounding in his throat, making it difficult to swallow. Sh- Shit. That had been the fifth time that month where Akashi had to tear himself out of another nightmare. They made him feel nauseous, to a point where he'd had to sit up in bed and swallow deep, slow breaths in order to cool himself down. And he did just that, reaching his hands up to rub at his eyes before taking a tense look around his room. Exhaling heavily, Akashi turned to look at the desk near his bed. His phone was there. Hesitating for only a second, he reached his hand out and took the device into his hands. When the screen lit up, a text message from Bokuto waited there for him. Sleep well, Akashi. It had been sent 2 hours ago. Akashi swiped and unlocked his phone with trembling hands. From Akashi, sent at 2:47 a.m. Are you there? Bokuto. Yeah. Akashi? I thought you were asleep. Akashi had to wait almost a minute for Bokuto's response. It was the longest minute he'd ever been forced to sit through. Akashi. I woke up. Nightmares. Bokuto. Nightmare? You had a nightmare? Was it bad? Akashi. Well, it managed to wake me up. Bokuto. The quiet kind of wake up? Akashi. No, more like the cliched kind, where you sit up in bed in a cold sweat. Bokuto. Are you calming down? Are you feeling better? Akashi stared at the text message and let out a shaking sigh. Judging by his still trembling hands, he knew he wasn't. Akashi. Yeah, I'm just a little shaken. Bokuto. I don't believe you on that yeah part. Akashi. I'm fine. Bokuto. Alright. Well, we'll just see about that. Furrowing his brow, Akashi stared at his phone screen and lay his head down sideways. It wasn't like Bokuto to question what he said in such a straightforward fashion. Akashi. There's nothing to see. He pressed send and watched the phone carefully, waiting for the small ellipses to appear on the lower left side of the screen. But instead, he was greeted with nothing. He didn't get a response, nor did he see any signs of responding. Akashi frowned and left his phone screen alone to dim and blacken, held it in his shaking hands, and closed his eyes in an attempt to try and find sleep again. It was difficult, however, as each time he tried to drift off to sleep, that unnerving fear of having the same dream would jerk him back awake. Akashi groaned softly and covered his face. Bzzz. Akashi's phone vibrated against his forehead. He flinched and pulled his hand away to stare at the screen. Bokuto, look outside! What? Akashi kicked his legs out of bed and strode to his window. Impossible. He pulled apart the blinds and looked down. Out, in the dead of night, stood Bokuto, with the burgundy scarf around his neck, a jacket, jeans, and slippers. He looked up and grinned, and waved widely in Akashi's direction. Akashi's eyes widened. No, 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 no. He pulled away from the window sill and ran out of his room, straight downstairs and to the front door. He threw it open and faced Bokuto, who was jogging to him with a smile and a shiver in each step. May I come in? No, no, why not? We're going back to the hospital. We're going back to the hospital right now. I'm taking you back. Akashi reached his arms out and pushed Bokuto away. What? No! Bokuto refused to budge. He pushed Akashi back this time. I just came from there. Exactly, because you belong there. Akashi felt his Akashi felt that his words were a bit bitter, but he had no other way of telling Bokuto the truth. You're sick, you need medical attention. So I can't sleep. Bokuto swatted Akashi's hands away. What's the big deal? It's more than that. He exerted more force into his arms, getting Bokuto to take a step back. You've had two panic attacks this week already, and your hallucinations are getting worse. My home is not a place for you to be right now. I get panic attacks when you're not around, Bokuto answered simple-mindedly. And my hallucinations aren't all that bad. Akashi clenched his jaw behind a mildly irritated face. Stop trying to act like this isn't such a big deal. You may not think it is, but I. He paused and reached his arms out to get in another shove. Let's just go. I don't want to. Bokuto grabbed Akashi's hands with his own. Bokuto, stop. I don't want to go back. So why did you even sneak out? How did you even sneak out? By sneaking out. They don't pay much attention to me anyway. Akashi yanked his hands away and stared at Bokuto. As much as it infuriated him, he knew that Bokuto wasn't going to go anywhere unless he let him into his home first. He swallowed thickly. Get inside. Akashi stepped to the side. Bokuto's eyes did the familiar light up thing as he bounced into Akashi's home. He removed his slippers and waited at the entrance for his friend to enter. Akashi stepped in and shut the door behind him. You chose you chose the perfect night, Akashi said bitterly as he hobbled up the stairs. My parents aren't home. It's not like I would have made any noise, Bokuto all but shouted, following after him. Akashi sighed. I'll get you back to the hospital by 7 in the morning. Fine by me. Imagine the looks on their faces when they see me coming in from outside. Imagine their faces when they notice I'm not even in my room. Bokuto was elated. Akashi entered his room and shut the door behind Bokuto. I'm going straight to sleep. But I thought you had a nightmare. Bokuto stood that Bokuto stood at the side of Akashi's bed. I did. He paused for a moment. Is that why you came here? Because of the nightmare? Bokuto stared at Akashi. Because you said you were okay, and I knew you weren't. Akashi was at a loss for words. He returned Bokuto's gaze, then looked down quickly afterwards. A hand tugged at his shirt weakly. I see. He reached a hand out to turn on the lamp that sat on his nightstand. Taking a seat on the edge of the bed, Bokuto rubbed the back of his neck. What was the dream about? Akashi sat in bed and wrapped a sheet around himself. He tossed the navy blue one to Bokuto, remembering how fond he was of it the last time he'd come over. He watched as Bokuto gathered it up in his arms and threw it around himself, then stared at Akashi, waiting for his response. He sighed. I was drowning. His hands picked at the small lint rolls that stuck to his sheet. Drowning in something black, sort of like tar. I was fighting and trying to get out, but I had no power over it whatsoever. I was so weak, and it got into the point where I could barely breathe. My face was the only thing sticking out. Akashi cocked his head back to demonstrate this, with a finger tapping his chin. I was struggling, but in the end I couldn't move. I was shouting, but no sounds came out. No one could hear me. No one was around. Akashi shrugged. The liquid started flooding into my mouth and nose, and it wasn't until I was suffocating that I forced myself awake. Akashi didn't say another word afterwards. He only bundled himself up in the sheets that surrounded him. He turned his head to look out the window, eyeing the moon timidly. Shifting in his seat, Bokuto pulled closer to Akashi, one hand grasping the blanket that had been given to him. Akashi remained in the place with the thought in mind that Bokuto would respect his personal space and sit a foot or two away from him. But to his apparent surprise, Bokuto leaned his head on Akashi's shoulder and slipped an arm around him. Akashi squirmed in discomfort. What are you doing? Comforting? Bokuto replied, lifting his head. Isn't that what humans do? Akashi watched him carefully. Don't look like you're not one. Bokuto turned forward quietly and placed his head back on Akashi's shoulder. They didn't speak for a moment, and the room was filled with the hushed sounds of the outside. Hey, what? Let's watch Cloud Atlas. No. Akashi shook his head. Bokuto grumbled to himself. Why not? Don't you have it in your laptop? I do, but I don't want to watch it. It's a long movie, and I've watched it about 7 times already. Well, if you've watched it 7 times, then why not watch it at night time? Because it's 3 in the morning, and I want to fit some sleep into my schedule. By the time that movie ends, it'll be 6. Then I'll have to walk you to the hospital before the doctors find out you're missing and lose your minds. A laugh escaped Bokuto, the sound curling his lips into a smile. What if they've already found out? Then that would be a problem. And then they turn my room upside down in an attempt to find me. That'd be a tough mess to clean up. Turning his head, Bokuto looked at Akashi. Everything you say is so straightforward. Why is that? I don't know. Akashi inhaled slowly. It's just how I am. Sometimes I think I'm funny, but people never laugh at my jokes. Bokuto snorted. When have you ever tried to make a joke? When I said that it would be a tough mess for them to clean up. Akashi sounded genuinely confused. Didn't that come off as remotely funny? Bokuto couldn't help but guff, tilting his head back. That was your idea of a joke? You're too loud. Quiet. Akashi shoved his visitor lightly. Despite this, it only seemed to make Bokuto laugh even harder. Akashi pursed his lips in frustration, but this look quickly vanished as a small laugh fell from his lips. Well, you're laughing now. Well, you're laughing now. He tried to hide his smile. So I guess I'm pretty good at being funny. Bokuto glanced at him. Yeah, but for all the wrong reasons. His laughter died down along with Akashi's. You know, I don't think I've ever heard you laugh, or seen you smile for that matter. Shrugging one shoulder, Akashi grabbed his phone. Well, now you have. Bokuto looked over at the phone screen. What are you doing? Setting an alarm for 6 a.m. Akashi set his phone down and leaned back slowly, resting the back of his head against his pillow. Bokuto followed, his arms still around him. This is strange. He stared up at the ceiling and sighed. Why do I let him do this? Akashi's head slumped to the side, in Bokuto's direction. I hope you don't mind me sleeping. He whispered the words. Of course I don't. I showed up to your house unannounced at 3 in the morning. You've got all the right to sleep. I just hope it isn't rude. It isn't. Bokuto's arm unconsciously squeezed Akashi closer to his side. All right. He closed his eyes. Good night. Akashi pulled his arms close, wrapping the sheets around himself. See you in 3 hours, Bokuto whispered. Complete and utter silence befell them afterwards. Akashi had kept his eyes closed for quite a while, trying to fall into a deep sleep, but found that he couldn't, or at least not as quickly as he thought he could. He kept his breathing controlled and steady for about 40 minutes. He looked sound asleep, but he was actually drifting between the real world and the dream realm. There was silence, and then there was a sound. A subtle, gentle sound. The sound someone cautiously moving their arm. The sound of someone cautiously moving their arm when they didn't wish to wake someone. Akashi remained in his false sleeping position, feeling that it would take much more of an effort for him to open his eyes and check around than stay dormant. And so he continued to try and grasp sleep, expecting nothing from the noise. It was because of this that he was so surprised when he felt a gentle sensation against his forehead. It took all he it took all of his power not to flinch when he felt the unfamiliar touch. They were fingers, hesitant fingers that ghosted over Akashi's forehead in order to push a loose strand of hair. Keeping his eyes closed, took in the feeling of this, but he could sense the heavy amount of reluctance in each movement that Bokuto's hands carried out. Bokuto was afraid to wake Akashi, so much that his hands trembled slightly whenever he'd push Akashi's fangs away. Slowly but gradually, Akashi's heart rate picked up. His hands twitched once, and he moved closer, leaning into Bokuto's touch. This backfired, however, the other's hands withdrew quickly. Akashi relaxed then, keeping the sleeping act alive. Bokuto did not move a muscle after having seen Akashi stir. The last thing he wanted to do was to wake him up, so he lay there. So they lay in silence for minutes on end. Akashi figured that Bokuto would keep to himself for the rest of the night, so he put his focus back to trying to sleep. He held the same he held the same position and felt himself dozing off. I'm sorry. The words were barely a whisper, but they came without a warning. It almost sounded as if Bokuto were talking to himself. Akashi remained still and silent. I never meant to drag you into my life. Bokuto inhaled all that he could. Akashi felt his chest rise. He could practically hear the frown in his voice. I know that I'm unbearable. I know that I'm a lost cause. I know that you know that too. And yet, you still stick by me. He paused for a moment, then spoke up again. His voice was a soft tremor. So, thank you. Bokuto had nothing more to say after that. He lay his cheek on the top of Akashi's head and kept still, daring not to wake him. But Akashi now couldn't find it in himself to sleep. Bokuto's words haunted him, and they repeated themselves over and over in his mind. He swallowed once, hoping to get rid of the lump in his throat. After that night, things had after that night, things had only gone downhill for them. From then, Akashi took a glance outside the window, only to instantly throw on his clothes and toss his bag over his shoulders. He jogged downstairs, slipped his shoes on, and was out of the door in seconds, making his way down the familiar route to the hospital. Above, the clouds were dense, and they gathered quickly, casting a dark shroud over Akashi's path. He zipped his jacket up to shield himself from the harsh winds that came his way, and advanced forward. There was definitely a storm coming his way, so Akashi knew that Bokuto would need him. A month and 16 days had passed since Bokuto's final visit to Akashi's home, and once he'd been taken back to the hospital, the doctors and nurses made sure to to keep a closer eye on him, and with good reason. Not only was Bokuto the kind of guy to sneak out when no one was watching, but his condition had quickly begun to worsen without warning. Before then, he would normally lose several pounds a week, but ever since the night he snuck out, his weight loss could only be described as alarming. In the span of a little over a month, Bokuto had gone from a general 155 pounds to a mere 97 pounds. Last time they'd weighed him, the drastic weight loss was awful enough, but as if to add insult to the injury, Bokuto's worsening condition also made it increasingly difficult for him to walk, move, and speak. Takashi frowned heavily as he entered the hospital. He made his way up the same path, walking swiftly and without pause. That was until he saw a familiar face. Kuro. Akashi stopped in his tracks, in front of Bokuto's room. The black-haired male looked up from his hands. He faked a smile. Hey, Akashi, right? Long time. Yeah, I'm. He turned his head. Is someone in there? He didn't wait for Kuro to respond and glanced into Bokuto's room. Surely enough, he noticed Kenma sitting in the seat next to Bokuto's bed. His back was facing the door, and Bokuto seemed to have all of his attention on him. Will Kenma allow me to enter the room? Kuro rubbed the lower part of his face with his hand. Nope. He leaned back in his chair. Take a seat. Kenma isn't usually the kind of person to speak to people one on one, so I think you'd better leave them alone. Inhaling deeply, Akashi lingered in place, then sat down in the empty seat next to Kuro. You seem a bit anxious. Kuro looked at Akashi sideways. I am. There is a storm coming. Bokuto doesn't do well with those. Ah, Kuro looked at the ceiling, as if he would be able to see the clouds from there. I hadn't noticed that one was rolling in. He slowly lowered his head, and folded his arms. Didn't think you knew that about him. Akashi turned his head to face Kuro. Was he ever fond of them? Don't think so. In the past, he would always get sort of tense and paranoid whenever a storm would pass over his head. But that was kind of it. Now I bet he suffers panic attacks because of them. Akashi looked down. He does. Storms trigger them. Kuro made a grunting noise and had nothing more to say on the subject. Akashi figured he should stay quiet too. He knit his fingers together and kept his eyes down, anticipating when the first boom of thunder would sound. He would have to close Bokuto's blinds and take his mind out of it somehow. Show him a movie or play a game with him that would result in him to calm down quickly. Akachi rubbed the back of his neck hastily and closed his eyes. 97 fucking pounds. Startled, Akachi opened his eyes and glanced in Kuro's direction. He growled at nothing in particular. I'm sorry? 97 pounds, right? That's how much he supposedly weighs now? Once Akashi realized what Kuro was talking about, he instantly felt his spirits fall. Yes. Fucking bullshit. He swore without a filter. Wincing, Akashi turned his head away. He'd only spoken to Kuro once before, and they barely exchanged any words. He didn't know how to deal with him now, so he remained silent. He twisted his fingers and pursed his lips, wary of what Kuro would say next. All of this is so... Ugh. Why the hell does this have to happen to him? At such an early damn age, too! He hissed his words under his breath, openly frustrated with the situation. He turned 22 3 months ago. Akashi lowered his head. It's not fair. It's not! But here we are, and there he is. Kuro rubbed his elbow, irate, and sighed in defeat. I'm not coming back to visit him anymore. Not after this. I've seen enough. He turned to look at Akashi. Keep him company from now on. I don't know how you do it, but when you're around him, you help him forget. Akashi kept his eyes down. He wouldn't show this, but Kuro's words had hit him harder than he could ever imagine. They sat heavily in the pits of his stomach, churning and pestering him, urging him to throw up. But he only swallowed and kept his composure, just as he'd been doing since the day he met Bokuto. Akashi reached his hand up to rub the back of his neck roughly, administering a feeling of discomfort to one area in order to ignore the pain that was threatening to swallow his heart. He closed his eyes in a slow blink and kept his breathing quiet. Having been neck deep in his own sorrows, Kuro was blind to Akashi's. He forced himself to stand after some time, tapping his against his pants. Keep doing what you're doing. His voice was low. Akashi nodded in response. Of course. I couldn't stop, even if I tried. A biting chuckle escaped Kuro. Yeah, ain't that the horror of it all? He rubbed his chin and stalked his way down the hall. Keep in touch, Akashi. Of course. He repeated the same phrase, finding that it was difficult to search for words at the time. He watched as Kuro walked away, far enough for the small details to become blurred. He only looked like a tall, thin black mass now that he stood near the stairway. He was waiting for Kenma, but Akashi wondered why he hadn't waited for him in the seat that he was initially sitting in. Just then, as Akashi bit down on the inside of his lower lip, he turned his head in time to catch a glimpse of Kenma lowering his head towards Bokuto. It wasn't necessarily a bow. It seemed more along the lines of an act of it seemed more along the lines of an act of affection, or at least as affectionate as Kenma could get, which wasn't much. He touched his forehead to Bokuto's shoulder, which only earned a small laugh from him. Bokuto talked quietly in response to Kenma, gave a nod, and smiled. He never seemed to stop smiling. Once he saw this, Kenma picked himself up from his seat, put his hands at his side, and bowed his head. He didn't last another second in Bokuto's company before he turned and briskly walked out of the room. He kept his head down and played the fool, pretending he didn't see Akashi. In seconds, Kenma was down the hall, making his way down the stairs, having completely ignored Kuro as well. Kuro didn't seem surprised in the slightest. He only waved goodbye at a staring Akashi before following his small friend down the stairs. Honestly, Akashi barely managed to wave back before he heard his name being called from that all too familiar room by that all too familiar voice. He directed his attention to a grinning Bokuto who eagerly sat up in bed. Akashi almost smiled back, and he would have, too, if it hadn't been for the thunder that sounded its arrival from above. He watched as Bokuto's smile faded instantly, his eyes having gone from half lidded to wide in a second. His hands squeezed tightly around the navy blue blanket that enveloped him. Akashi, I know. He walked ahead quickly, straight into the room. He pushed the chair away and found Bokuto's side in bed. Frail, shaking fingers pushed through his own white hair in an attempt to calm himself down. But another thunderclap sounded, louder that time. Bokuto flinched, hard enough to make the bed shiver. Fuck. His voice broke in terror. Look at me, it's going to be fine. Akashi spoke in a calm, slow voice. His hands took Bokuto's own, and he held it gently. It was cold and shook in short bursts. You will get through this. You always do. Staring down wide-eyed at the floor of the hospital room, Bokuto fought to find words. Akashi, don't. Bokuto struggled with his breathing. Don't what? Don't leave me. I won't leave you. He moved closer, his other hand taking hold of Bokuto's. Just breathe with me. Bokuto nodded frantically and forced himself to comply with Akashi, as he always did. He was the only person who could get him through those horrible moments after all. Heavy raindrops pelted against the window as Bokuto's frantic sounds filled the room. Akashi was glad to have made it in time. That had been one of Bokuto's worst panic attacks yet. Hey, Akashi. Hmm. Hmm? When do you think it'll snow? I don't know. Snow falls at random. Yeah, but do you think it will snow soon? Or maybe January? I hope so. That would be nice. Tokyo needs a little more snow now and then. Yeah, yeah, when it falls, I want to go out and stand in it. Akashi sat cross-legged in the seat adjacent to Bokuto's bed. He looked up at the sickly one when he'd say those words, trying to meet his gaze, but ultimately finding no yellow eyes to look into. Bokuto had turned his head away. He was staring outside at the white clouds that shrouded the skies, mesmerized by just how colorless it made everything seem. It was one of those white days, as Bokuto liked to call them. So he paid much more attention to the world beyond the glass than he did to his own confided life in the hospital. Bokuto breathed in deeply, the sound falling, filling the small space around them. The bed sheets crumpled beneath his hands. Are you sure you should be going out in the cold like that? I think I can handle it. Akashi didn't want to bring up the fact that Bokuto probably would no longer possess the ability to walk by the time any snow did get the chance to fall. So he kept his mouth shut. He rubbed his hands together weakly and tilted his head to the side. I guess you can, just as long as you're feeling better. Bokuto scoffed. It was a quiet sound. I am. Stop asking already. That was 6 years ago. 6 days ago. I know, but it was bad. It passed. Bokuto turned his head, the pillow crumbling under his neck. He looked at Akashi with heavy lidded eyes. He was extremely pale, and somehow thinner than before, but he kept that same smile on his face. I'm fine now. Akashi couldn't help but smile back at him. He leaned his chin against the palm of his hand and chortled, or at least as fine as you can get. Bokuto stared at Akashi sharply. His lips quivered before he could form his words. Shut up! A stronger laugh broke out from him, rattling his body as he lay down in the bed. I look like shit. I know. Akashi found himself laughing along with him. His quiet chuckle was louder than Bokuto's wholehearted laugh. You don't. You don't look like shit. He tried to hide his grin with his hand, but it was still visible from the gaps between his fingers. Bokuto reached out a hand, aimlessly trying to swat Akashi's own hand away. He tried to aim for it at the very least, but found it difficult to. Still, he continued. Don't cover that. Cover what? Your smile. Why? It isn't anything I barely ever get to see it. Bokuto's finger touched Akashi's knuckles. That was enough for Akashi to remove his hand from in front of his mouth slowly, moving it to rest over his chin. He smiled down at him. Bokuto's eyes stared forward with an engrossed gaze, his yellow hues taking a mental picture of what he probably would never see again. Many words dashed through his mind, but he could only think of three that would be the best for him to say to Akashi. He tried to open his mouth to say them, but he performed another action instead. Unconsciously, his hand grasped Takashi's own, and he dragged it down with his lack of strength, causing both of them to startle. Bokuto's eyes widened. I thought you would hold it up. It was sudden. Takashi stifled aloud. A laugh. It caught me off guard. I didn't mean to. It's all right. He smoothed his thumb over Bokuto's knuckles. I'm holding it now. Silently and almost in fascination, Bokuto stared at Akashi once again, longer this time before he looked up, then down, then away. He turned his head towards the window, away from Akashi. He couldn't face him. Pursing his lips timidly, Akashi ceased to speak. He studied the back of Bokuto's head, eyeing eyeing the messy strands of black and white hair that overlapped each other. His green eyes then fell to study his paling skin. His veins were easily noticeable now, and they bulged from beneath his flesh whenever he moved. Akashi's eyes lowered. focusing on the arm that was attached to the hand he was holding. He studied the small needle that was lodged into Bokuto's forearm, eyed the thin tube that was attached to this, and followed it up to the vial of IV fluid that hung above his head. Whatever was left of Akashi's smile faded. Ever since Bokuto's last panic attack, it had suddenly become much more difficult for him to control his words, movements, and actions altogether. Such a task as easy as swallowing was now a problem for Bokuto too, and after many failed attempts at keeping his food down, or getting it to go down in the first place, the nurses found it would be best if Bokuto received nourishment the only other way possible. That was through a tube. Over the span of 6 days, Akashi found that the only things Bokuto could manage to swallow were small snacks like grapes, ice cubes, and pocky sticks that were specifically strawberry flavored. Other than those things, Bokuto found it nearly impossible to stomach anything else. His only other choice was to lie there and accept whatever was in the liquid, whatever it was the IV liquid had to offer him. Looking back to Bokuto, he was relieved to see that he still had his attention on the window. At some time, while Akashi was spacing out, the blue blanket that surrounded Bokuto had been pulled up just below his chin, with only his arm hanging out to hold onto Akashi's hand. Bokuto Bokuto's breathing was quiet, and his hand never really remained still for a long time. It would shake every so often, and each time it did, Akashi would squeeze slightly in response. This was their unspoken communication. It was Akashi's way of letting Bokuto know that everything would be all right, and this would always comfort him, no matter the situation they were in. They both found it easier to believe in that lie than to accept the truth of what was to come. Right. Small break. Small break. We just reached the 2 hour mark, and that's just amazing, in my opinion. We are starting to get to that moment in the we're starting to get to that point where I don't want to read it because I know I'm gonna cry, but I feel like I need to finish it before like ending stream. So I'm very sad. I'm very sad, and I think I have a lot of regrets choosing uh this specific fanfic because I am very attached. I'm very emotionally dependent on Bokuto and Akashi and Genma and Kuro. So like all of them meshed together in one very sad fanfic. It's just not great for my mental health. And I think I'm starting to regret it, but we're gonna push through. We're gonna push through and we are gonna finish it. If that's the last thing we do. I'm gonna have a like 5 second break. Hmm. Hmm. Okay. On the numbingly cold day that was January 3rd at 8:04 p.m., snow had fallen for the first time that year. Bokuto was the first to notice this, but he had also been the last to say anything about it. It wasn't until Akashi looked up from his laptop screen that he realized it was snowing, heavily outside. His eyes lit up, intent on informing Bokuto, but when he turned his head to get a look at him, instead of being greeted by an enthusiastic friend. He was presented with an unfazed expression upon Bokuto's wary face. Kakashi frowned. Bokuto? Don't you see it? Looking up from the laptop screen, Bokuto directed his attention to Akashi. But the snow. It's snowing outside. Bokuto turned his head to catch another look out the window. Surely enough, snow was falling, and in chunks too. But this did not grasp Bokuto's attention. Frankly speaking, it had no effect on him in the slightest. He managed a feeble shrug and turned to continue on with the movie that he'd watched for the 30th time already. Akashi was genuinely confused. I thought you were waiting for the snow. I thought it was what you wanted. His eyelids drooped, his eyelids drooping and then snapping open again. Okuto made a small sound. I see it all the time. Just then, Akashi's lips parted in realization. Bokuto's hallucinations had become such a part of him that he thought the snow outside was just another mind trick. He breathed in sharply. It's not a hallucination, Bokuto. It's actually snowing. Bokuto looked up to stare out the window again. There was a longing in his eyes that Akashi couldn't stand to see. With barely an ounce of strength left, Bokuto pulled himself up a tad to get a better look outside. Curio- Curiosity had sparked within him. He wanted to know if it was real or not. He hated how difficult it had become for him to tell apart the real things from the fake ones. I'll show you. Akashi stood from his seat and walked to the window sill. There, he parted the glass slightly. A gust of icy wind charged its way into the room in an instant, draining the warmth from everything it touched. Bokuto's skin crawled, goosebumps pimpling his porcelain surface. He pulled the thick blanket over himself with much effort. Swiftly, Akashi closed the window, having gathered just enough snow off the edge for him to show Bokuto. He strode to him quickly, cupping the already melting snow in his hands. Bokuto held out his own, eager to see if it were true. See? Look! Akashi placed the small white compressed lump of snow into Bokuto's palm. Discerned a gasp from him. Bokuto stared down at the white clumps of melting ice, and with one finger he pressed against it to watch it fall apart. The tiny snowflakes deteriorated in the warmth of his palms, leaving a small puddle behind. A gasp escaped Bokuto. His eyes widened as much as they could. Akashi! I know. Take me outside! It's freezing. Akashi murmured the words and looked Bokuto up and down. He was nothing more than a blanket with a head. You tremble when it's 70 degrees outside in the room. Right now it's about 10 degrees outside. Please, Akashi. Pressing his lips into a thin slab of a line, Akashi shook his head once more. He found it much too difficult to say no to Bokuto, but it had to be done. I can't. But why? Bokuto's spirits fell. His frown deep. The weather would only hurt. The weather will only hurt you. You need to be protected. From what? Bokuto stared at Akashi, his features having gone from disappointed to unaccepting. Akashi drew in a breath, but found that he couldn't say anything. He watched Bokuto with a wary gaze, unaware of what he was to say next. I'm already in death road. I can barely speak. I can barely walk. I can't eat. I can't sleep. The last thing you He clenched his jaw, frustrated with himself and the words he spoke. You you need to do is worry about me catching a cold. Bokuto. Cold or not cold, I'm still not going to last very long. So please let me have this. His eyes were glued to Akashi's, and Akashi found that he was unable to look away. Bokuto's eyes said everything to him. He translated all his words. He translated all that his words could not. Akashi looked down and away from Bokuto, then back to the window. I think the window will be as far as we can go, he said in a hushed voice. That's fine with me. And just like that, a smile found Bokuto's face again. Akashi sighed to himself, frustrated with how easily he'd given in to Bokuto's begging. But, as he thought of it, he figured he couldn't be blamed for it. He didn't want to be the one to say no to someone who had little to nothing left in his life. There was that, and the fact that Akashi couldn't help but find Bokuto's smile endearing, no matter how sickly he looked when he wore one. Come on. Akashi reached a hand out to help Bokuto to his feet. He urged him to keep the blanket around him, but Bokuto insisted that he leave it behind. He held onto the ivy stand with one hand and Akashi's hand with his other as he hobbled over to the window. Bokuto's hands were cold as ice, causing Akashi's concern in him to grow even more. But no matter how much he worried for him, Akashi continued on their way to the window at a slow and steady pace until they finally made it. Once there, Bokuto pulled his hand from Akashi's and leaned it against the windowsill. The air was bitter and cold, and it hit Bokuto like a slap to the face as another gust of wind forced its way into the hospital room. This did not faze him, however, as Bokuto only closed his eyes and inhaled deeply, allowing the burn of the winter air to fill his lungs. When he exhaled, a puff of smoke left him. Bokuto stuck his head out of the window slightly and kept it there as snowflakes fell around him. Don't do that. Akashi pulled Bokuto back inside. He expected to hear a whine of resistance from him, but instead received nothing. Bokuto only complied and stuck his entire arm outside instead, watching as each individual snowflake passed around his limb, as if none wanted to touch him. On one occasion, one or two would land on him, and he would draw his hand in, con- in quickly to try and see if he could make out the small pattern on them. He would study them for a while until they melted and left behind nothing more than a droplet on his arm. After this, After this, he would repeat the same process, paying little to no mind to the freezing cold that surrounded him. Akashi watched Bokuto, mesmerized by his actions. He almost portrayed the behaviors of a child, sticking to an activity and refusing to let it up, repeating whatever he was to do without having anyone to tell him to stop. Akashi furrowed his brow and looked outside, away from Bokuto. That familiar feeling of dread was rising from deep within him, something Akashi wanted to forget. He placed one hand on the window sill and squeezed, his knuckles going wide. They shared another moment of silence, something that occurred more often than Akashi would have liked. Though Bokuto's speaking skills weren't as good as they used to be, he was still the more talkative one out of the two. So whenever he went silent, an unwelcome feeling of discomfort found its home within Akashi. He wanted to rid himself of this feeling, rid himself of this silence. So he searched his mind to haste for any word that could come to mind. He needed something, anything, to say to Bokuto, just so that he could liberate himself from the horrid feeling that threatened to overtake him. You know, I never asked, Akashi managed to say, staring out into the distance. Why are you so fond of the snow, Bokuto? He waited for an answer, but did not receive one. Unnerved, he spoke again. I mean, in your state now, it's a bit cliched, don't you think? This was his attempt at brightening the mood, or being funny, as some called it, but alas, his words had fallen flat on the ground as he received another empty silence from Bokuto. Kakashi frowned deeply. He turned his head to get a clear look at Bokuto's face, but instantly wished he hadn't. In his silence, Bokuto wept to himself, fat tears rolling down his cheeks in numbers. The hand that supported his weight against the windowsill trembled without pause, and his other remained outside, shaking in the cold dead of night. Several flake, several flakes had gathered on the outstretched arm, but they were not quick to melt. They settled there, deeming Bokuto one of them, for the reminder there of their frozen lives before they eventually melted or fell away. Akashi stared at Bokuto, opened his mouth to say something, but found that he couldn't form even one simple word. Realizing this, Akashi decided to take action instead and reached out to comfort him. But not even this he could do. His arms and legs were stiff, as were his eyes. All he could do was stare at the melancholic performance that played out before him. Do something. Akashi closed his mouth and swallowed. Do something, anything. Akashi's body didn't respond. He could only watch as those tears fell at a faster pace, down onto his hospital gown and onto the floor. The light that came from outside reflected off Bokuto's teardrops, lighting his face up in the most gentle of ways. Eventually, Bokuto drew his head Bokuto drew back his hand and let it fall to his side. He hung his head and tried to keep his crying controlled in the best way possible, but this proved to be very difficult as sobs broke out of him, causing his entire being to shake. After moments of trying to gather himself, Bokuto choked out two simple words with quivering lips. Why me? Kashi stared on as his mind searched for words. He found some and said them without a second thought. Because life is unfair. Bokuto reached up a cold, frail hand to wipe at the mess that was his face. I w- wanted to do so many things. I know. Akachi pulled his hand into a fist, mentally scolding himself for the present lack of emotion in his voice. As Bokuto backed away from the window, Akashi was quick to close it, locking the bitter night out of the room for the remainder of the night. Then he reached out and took hold of Bokuto's arm to help him back to bed. Once they'd reached it, Bokuto resumed his usual position and wrapped a thick blanket around himself, then turned away from Akashi. He watched the window quietly, paying no mind to his visitor, or so Akashi thought. In a matter of minutes, just as Akashi started to fidget, Bokuto spoke up. Akashi? Yes. His undivided attention was on Bokuto. He hesitated for a moment, but finally spoke up. I don't want you to visit me anymore. Akashi's eyes squinted to the words, and he leaned forward in shock. What? Please, don't visit me anymore. No. Akashi stood from his seat. Please, no. It's a little too late for that, Bokuto. A shiver racked Akashi, causing the hairs on the back of his neck to stand. Akashi, please. No. It's my final answer. No is my final answer. He stalked over to the other side of the bed, where he would be able to look at Bokuto's face. Once Bokuto noticed this, he turned his head and slowly rolled away. Akashi's eyes widened, his emotion now falling victim to a strange mix of fear and fury. Bokuto, what's the meaning of this? Bokuto didn't respond. He remained in the same position and only moved his hand to wipe at his face again. Answer me! Sucking his teeth, Bokuto pulled the blanket up just beneath his chin. It took some time, but he finally answered. I don't want you to grow any more attached to me than you already are. Hachi nearly scoffed. What makes you think I'm attached to you? I never said that I was. This time, Bokuto directed his attention to Akashi. He wore a grimace upon his reddened face. Shut up, Akashi. He breathed in deeply, frustrated on himself and the gradual growth of his speech impediment, but he continued on. I, I know you hate hos- hospitals. Don't come telling me now that you have only been coming here every day because you wanted to. Akachi had nothing else to say. He stared at Bokuto with his lips parted, as if he were going to speak, but ended up speechless. I know that you care, e- even if it's just a little bit. Bokuto covered his mouth and coughed suddenly. He found that speaking wasn't making much more energy. He found that speaking was taking much more energy than he thought. Still, he continued to talk. I don't know much uh, about this disease. Pa- Partly because I was too afraid to read up on it. But I know I don't have much time left. His frustration slowly faded, and all that was left behind upon his pale face was a look of defeat. 1, maybe 2 months at most, if I'm lucky. That's how long I have left. The air around Akashi thickened, and suddenly he found it more difficult to breathe. Bokuto looked down and twisted his lips to the side. I heard the doctors talking. Mm, They don't don't know how to heal me. So, from beneath the blanket, Akashi could see Bokuto's shoulders rise and fall. It's just a slow downhill ride from here. And I don't want you to see it all happen. Bokuto lay there glass-eyed, his welled-up tears glinting in the dim lighting of the room. I don't want you to watch me decay. Small tears spilled out of Bokuto's eyes and rolled down his hauntingly placid features. So I figured if you left now, you wouldn't have to, and it wouldn't hurt so much. Once again, that crippling spell took hold of him, and Akashi couldn't move, nor could he speak. All he could do was watch in muted anguish as Bokuto finally accepted what had become of his short life. Akashi realized that those smiles he'd seen before were smiles of denial, forced grins that tried desperately to trick Bokuto into thinking that everything would be fine. But he couldn't keep it up forever, not in the state that he was in. Bokuto had always been struggling to keep a positive front, but inside he was falling apart all along. Akashi knew this now. In an attempt to move, he tapped his fingers against his leg at an impatient pace. He was trying to he was trying everything he could to psych himself into doing at least something to let Bokuto know that he was there for him. Do something. As if he were one of the living dead. Akashi forced one leg forward, then the next, until he was touching the bedside. He pushed his negative thoughts aside and sat himself down in bed, right next to Bokuto. Akashi did not give him time to react as he moved closer still, and when he was close enough, he lowered his head to lean it on Bokuto's shoulder. Akashi squeezed his hands together to keep them from shaking uncontrollably. I'm not leaving, Kotaro. His voice was hushed, gentle, and nothing you say will make me leave. Bokuto kept silent. Not a word left him, even as he reached a hand up to wipe at his face again. He only sniffed on occasion and shifted in place, but never did he say anything to oppose Akashi's decision. He was glad. Akashi turned his head slightly, his cheek gently resting on Bokuto's shoulder. He took in a slow, deep breath and closed his eyes, and his eyebrows knit together for only a second. His hands quivered as he dug his nail into his knuckles. Bokuto no longer smelled like a hospital. Bokuto smelled like home. Give me a second. I'm gonna have a small second to compose myself because I'm probably gonna cry. So give me a second. Okay. Okay. The reflection of the ending moving credits could be seen in Akashi's eyes as they scrolled up along the screen of his laptop. Sitting back, he reached a hand out and paused the movie that'd been on screen. So, how was it? Watching the movie for the thousandth time. There was almost a hint of sarcasm in his voice. Laying next to Akashi, a ghostly pale Bokuto smiled. Good. Bokuto eased back and buried his head into his pillow. He looked in Akashi's direction. It took him a moment for Bokuto to focus on him. Pulling his laptop close, Akashi smoothed his finger along the mousepad. He looked to the lower right corner of the screen. January 19th, 6:40 p.m. Akashi pulled a solemn face and closed the laptop. He moved in his seat and sat straight against the head of the bed, then looked down at Bokuto. His tired eyes were on Akashi. He was grinning, forcing a smile on his own. Forcing a smile of his own, Akashi tilted his head only slightly. What are you smiling at? He reached a hand out and touched Bokuto's forehead. He was cool to the touch, colder than most. Akashi was quick to withdraw his hand, but managed it discreetly. It took a moment for Bokuto to respond, but after some time he managed some words. Thank you. Don't worry about it. A sheepish a sheepish grin curled Akashi's lips. I know you're fond of that movie. He looked down at Bokuto as he said this, and glanced away soon after. Something told him that those words weren't meant for the movie, but Akashi shoved this thought away. He twisted his body to reach for the box of pocky that sat on the counter. He opened it and pulled out one. Do you want one? Bokuto nodded and stretched a wobbling arm out. Akashi placed it between his fingers, and Bokuto retracted his hand to hold the biscuit snack against himself. He held it to his nose with some difficulty and breathed in the strawberry scent, and then let his arm fall. He touched at it lightly, twirled it shakily between his fingers, and studied it. Be- but he never ate it. Akashi placed the box back to the counter and huffed softly. You seem to have grown more attached to that pocky stick than me. Bokuto looked up, surprised, and glanced back down at the snack in his hands. It took time for Akashi's words to reach him, but when they finally did, his face lit up as he broke out in laughter. It was the weakest sound Akashi had ever heard. Ah, I finally said something funny. Akashi chuckled with Bokuto, folding his arms in the process. I told you I had my moments every so. I have I had my moments every so often. Bokuto's laughter died down, and he closed his eyes. Rarely. Give me a break here. Akashi's trolling had been dragged out for a few seconds longer before he, too, quieted down. They remained speechless in each other's company for several minutes before Bokuto actually spoke up, his voice sounding nothing like more his voice sounding like nothing more than a mere whisper. Eiji. Akashi looked at him. Mm-hmm. Bokuto swallowed thickly and toyed with the pocky in his hand. Ask me why I like Cloud Atlas so much. Perplexed, Akashi directed his full attention to Bokuto. Well, all right. Kotaro, why do you like Cloud Atlas so much? He watched Bokuto intently, curious to know what his answer would be. Looking up at Akashi with eager eyes, as if he'd been asked the question of out of his free will, Bokuto gladly answered. So, you know in the movie when characters die in one life. He kept very yellow eyes on Akashi, waiting for him to nod. Once he did, Bokuto continued. Well, I like it when they find each other again in another life. Bokuto's voice was soft, measly, and carried no force to it. But as he spoke about his favorite scene, Akashi could sense a powerful vibe coming from him, one that wasn't there before, a hopeful one. It makes me feel like I'll have another life, one beyond this one that's better, where I can actually wake up to you and be with you. A smile played on his pale, thin lips, one where we can live normal lives instead of living this one. Tashi couldn't find any words to say at that moment. He stared at Bokuto and could only nod with whatever it was that he thought he was agreeing with. He felt as if all the air had been squeezed out of his body by the words that Bokuto had spoken. Of all the things that Bokuto could found most endearing about the movie, Akashi never thought it would be that. Managing a miserable smile, Akashi roughly rubbed his palm with his thumb. You know, I would like that. Very much. He spoke gently in Bokuto's direction. Me too. Bokuto's eyes never left Akashi. He stared at him intently and watched every move he made, to the point where this had captured Akashi's attention. Why do you watch me like that? His emerald eyes met golden ones. The thought of the question was as though the question was asked clearly, Bokuto didn't make a sound, nor did he move. He instead continued to stare in Akashi's direction with hopeful eyes. After what felt like the longest 10 seconds of his life, a sudden shudder charged down Akashi's spine, causing goosebumps to rise on his flesh. He held his breath, then proceeded to ask again. Kotaro, why do you watch me like that? It took every fiber of his being to keep his voice from trembling. It was then that Bokuto's eyes blinked in realization, and slowly but surely he moved his lips to answer. Just us. He replied in what almost sounded like a surprised tone. I didn't want you to leave. Sometimes when I blink, You aren't there anymore. Bokuto rubbed one of his eyes, then the other, and let his hands drop to his sides. Akashi tried to hide his frown. His eyes looked down at Bokuto's hands. They were thin and bony, and he could see those small blue veins curling over the bones beneath his flesh. He reached out a hand. He reached a hand out and took Bokuto's hand in his own. Bokuto's automatic reaction to the warmth was to curl his fingers around Akashi's grasp. He looked at him and exhaled through his nose quietly. Akashi met his gaze, then looked down. Don't worry, I'm still here. Bokuto nodded feebly against his pillow. I'm still here, too. His voice was weaker than before, if possible. Akashi nodded with him. Yeah, you're still here, too. With what little strength he had left, Bokuto beamed. Akashi wished he could do the same. Okay. New message from Kuro sent January 31st at 2:25 p.m. Hey, are you there? Akashi. Yes, I am. Kuro. How are things? Akashi. Things could be better, things could be worse. Kuro. May I ask how Bokuto's doing? Akashi. He's hanging on. Kuro. Can he still walk or talk? Akashi. No, he can't. He lost the ability to walk a little more than a week ago. His ability to speak left him soon after. Kuro. I see. You really are straightforward, aren't you? Akashi. I don't know any other way to put it. Sorry. Akashi looked up from his phone after sending the message and turned his head to notice that Bokuto was once again staring at him with acute interest. His eyes read, Who's that? Stuffing his phone in his pocket, Akashi shrugged. Just Kuro. He said the name with a lack of interest to try and soften the blow, but Akashi knew that no matter how he approached it, Bokuto would frown when he heard the name. And he did. Bokuto looked down at Akashi's hand. His eyes gave away just how much he missed his friend. Feeling an amount of guilt build up within his chest, Akashi pulled out his phone just as quickly as he'd hid it away. Would you like for him to send a photo? Bokuto looked back up and thought for a moment, then nodded. Playing off this, Akashi texted Kuro to send an image of himself for Bokuto to see. It took quite some time for a message from Kuro to arrive, but when it did, Akashi realized that he'd sent a video instead of what was initially asked for. Akashi leaned over on his seat to move himself closer to Bokuto. With one elbow on the bed, he held his phone so that the both of them could see. Bokuto stared at the screen with interested eyes, wondering what the content would consist of. Akashi pressed play, and the video of Kuro started to play. He sat at home in bed, with a snug fitting shirt on and his hair an absolute mess. What's up, guys? I know you didn't tell me to send a video, but I'm not someone who follows rules. He pulled a mock cool expression, but this was cut short as someone else spoke up. From the background of the video, a low voice could be heard. What? Did you just say that to yourself? No. Wow, no, I'm taking a video. Kuro panned the phone to his side, and a blurred Kenma came into focus on screen. He sat cross-legged, legged, and with a shirt on that was 2 sizes too big, and a hat that looked as if it had been placed on his head without consent. His head was down, and his fingers moved swiftly over the buttons on the gaming device that he held in his hands. At one point, he reached the hand up to grab the beanie off his head, and he aimlessly chucked it to the ground with force. Say hi, Kenma! Wait, what? I didn't hear what you said. Kenma looked up and was greeted with a front-facing camera. Quickly, he got up from the bed and walked off. Don't record me. At least say hi, Kuro called. Hi. The disembodied voice came from off-screen. And that's Kenma for you. Kuro groaned as he repositioned himself in bed, and then he smiled. But putting him aside, I hope all is well. Um, he scratched at his cheek, just below his eye. I miss you guys. I miss you especially, Bokuto. Hang in there, alright? Akaashi, don't give him a hard time, or you and I are going to fucking fight. Bokuto smiled wide at those words. He would have laughed if he could. A grin ghosted across Akashi's lips as well, but it was quick to vanish. Well, I guess that's it for now. I would have Kenma say bye too, but he turned his head to look around. He left the room? Yeah, he left the room. So I'll just say bye for him. See you, Bokuto. Keep it cool, and remember, you're the best. He held his hand up in a peace sign, and the video ended with him on screen. Akashi sighed. He thought the video had gone by too quickly, but it had actually lasted a little under 30 seconds. For a guy whose name is Kuro, he sure is a colorful one. Akashi sat up and placed his phone on the counter. Bokuto nodded and looked up at Akashi once again. You guys were best friends, huh? Bokuto nodded once more. He struggled to raise a hand, and he slowly twirled in his index finger in a circles at the side of his head. Akashi snorted softly and leaned back in his seat. Is he crazy? The smile on Bokuto's lips grew just a little more, signifying that he'd answer yes to Akashi's question. It was moments like this that made Akashi realize just how much of an innocent soul Bokuto really was. Every now and then, it would come to him that Bokuto was only 20 years old, and that fact only weighed Akashi down even more than it usually did. It hurt him to think that Bokuto had barely even experienced the joys of a young adult's life before the crippling disease had taken a hold of him. It was frustrating. It was infuriating. And it was overall saddening. But Akashi could not show any of this. Not in front of Bokuto. So instead of putting a sour expression, Akashi only kept a neutral one, like he always did. It was his best and only way to hide his pain. Several hours had passed since the message from Kuro, and both Bokuto and Akashi didn't do much. Without a voice, Bokuto couldn't keep up a conversation as well as he used to, no matter how hard he tried. Even if he could speak, he wouldn't have been able to talk for long considering the state he was in. His movements were uncoordinated and slow, and the only sounds that he could manage were meek and most of the time inaudible. At times, Bokuto would, would do nothing but lie there in bed, twitching back away whenever his body tried so desperately to fall into the sleeping state that it once knew. When this would happen, he'd pull a frustrated expression for only a moment before his face grew too tired to hold it any longer. When Bokuto was like this, Akashi would normally look away to spare himself the sight of it all. But on rare occasions, there were times when he'd have no choice but to watch Bokuto fall apart at the hands of his illness, and he hated it. For every time Akashi would witness this, his mind would repeat one phrase, whether he wanted to hear it or not. This is what a dying person looks like. Looking down swiftly, Akashi's sights locked onto his hands. He glared at them intensely with the same placid expression of his, making this look all the more unnerving. He wanted the thought to leave his mind. He wanted nothing to do with it. He forced those thoughts away and replaced them with new ones. Ones that said, "He's not dying. He's going to be fine." But as he thought of it, as he narrowed down the true meanings of both phrases, he ultimately could not decide which of the two were more horrifying. Akashi closed his eyes and he heaved out a sigh, feeling more and more hopeless with each passing second. He feared he wouldn't be able to pull himself out of this state, but then it occurred to him that he was not alone. He was not alone in this. He felt the gentlest of taps in his arm against his arm, and he turned his head to meet eyes that were as concerned as they were exhausted. Akashi sat up straight and composed himself. "I'm fine," he commented softly, leaning back in his seat. "How are you feeling, Kotaro?" Bokuto blinked slowly. This was his way of saying that he was feeling all right. Not great, but all right. Akashi pursed his lips and nodded once. He found himself unable to say anything else. Sorry about that. Anyway, where did, where did we left off? I don't want to do this anymore. I'm so sad now. Okay, okay. Ah, Akashi pursed his lips and nodded once. He found himself unable to say anything else, figuring that Bokuto wouldn't have anything else to say either, but he was wrong. Oh, no, I lost it. I found it. I'm sorry. Again, he felt the light tapping against his arm. Surprised, Akashi gave Bokuto his attention again. Hmm? What is it? He turned the chair so that he was now facing Bokuto from the front. Gazing at Akashi, Bokuto frowned and tried to form some words, but failed in the end. He looked around and moved his fingers, trying to make out a phone. Akashi picked this up quickly, and he pulled his phone out for Bokuto to use. He opened his notes application and held the device in front of Bokuto. This was it was then that he started to inaccurately press at words that he was trying to make out. It took him some time to get down what he wanted to say, but after several minutes, he withdrew his hand. Akashi looked at his phone to read the sentence. It read, "If I knew those words I spoke a week ago would have been my last, I would have chosen them more carefully." Akashi started Akashi stared intensely at the screen, then tore his gaze away and looked back to Bokuto. "You weren't happy with those words?" Bokuto nodded. "Well then, if you had a second chance." Akashi hesitated. He almost didn't want to ask the question. What would you have chosen to say? Just as those words left Akashi's mouth, the clouds outside parted, allowing the setting sun's orange light to flood into the room. It illuminated both Bokuto and Akashi, and they squinted at the same time. Despite this, Akashi did not miss the look of slight nervousness that claimed Bokuto's features. He was now more curious than he'd ever been before. Um, Bokuto? You don't have to say it now, if you don't want to. Bokuto shook his head. So, you don't want to. He shook his head again, stronger this time. Ah, you do want to say it now. At this time, a weak sound left Bokuto's throat through a closed mouth, and he nodded. All right. Akashi shifted in his seat, now timid. He glanced to the side. How many words are there? In what you want to say, I mean. Responding as slowly as ever, Bokuto raised one hand. On that one hand, three fingers stuck out. Akashi felt his heart sink to his stomach. Another shudder threatened to rattle him, but he kept himself still, as difficult as that was. 3 words? That's all? Akashi forced a smile. They felt mandatory now. That's interesting. Please, please don't say them. He reached his arm out and held his phone in front of Bokuto for him to type. Please don't type them. I don't want to hear them. I don't want to read them. I don't want to know them. For what felt like an eternity, Bokuto the words on Akashi's phone. His hand wobbled so much that it was impossible to decipher which letter he was hitting. Akashi was close to holding his breath before Bokuto had finally drew his hand back. He let it fall over his stomach, and there it rested. His golden eyes searched the room for Akashi, and when he'd finally found him, those shining eyes of his lit up just a little more than usual. With a glint came his smile, and it was small and measly, but there. Akashi made sure to take a mental picture of this before he looked down and closed his eyes. He gripped his phone and his hand he gripped his phone in his hand and took a deep breath, filling his lungs with all the air he could before he exhaled through his nostrils. He turned his phone so that it was facing him, opened his eyes, and read the 3 words that would haunt him forever. Or so he thought. Akashi's eyes widened slightly, and his eyebrows knit together in surprise. What sat up on the screen was not what he thought it would be, but rather a simple compliment. You are beautiful. Freezing in his seat, Akashi read the words 10 times more over. He read the words 10 times over before he finally looked up. He could feel his heartbeat thumping hard against his chest, as if he wanted to break free. As if it wanted to break free. His eyes locked onto Bokuto's. You think I'm beautiful? He asked in a tone of disbelief. Mustering a weak nod, Bokuto's lips curled at the sides just a bit more. With this, he raised a quivering hand and his index finger. He was trying to tell Akashi something else. Guessing correctly, Akashi muttered, "One?" Bokuto kept his finger up, then moved his hand to point at himself. He did not give Akashi time to voice his guess, as he then moved his finger to point at his eye, then, finally, at Akashi. Weakly, Akashi parted his lips. He almost couldn't find his voice, but when he did, he tried his best to keep it from shaking. Since the day, since the first day you saw me. To this, Bokuto's arm fell and rested lightly on his stomach. He did the only thing that he could, and nodded again, then closed his eyes, and slightly turned his head away. Akashi watched cautiously as Bokuto's lips quivered into a wide grin. And as the light captured his features, Akashi realized just how embarrassed Bokuto actually was. His face glowed in the quietest his face glowed the quietest shade of red, and he tried to hide it away from Akashi. It seemed that, after finally hearing his pent up thoughts out loud, they had frayed his nerves more than he thought they would. Seeing this displayed Seeing this display unfold before him, Akashi could barely think. His heart beat a mile a minute. He found it difficult to swallow, and one of his legs bounced up and down rapidly. He didn't know how to react. He didn't know what to do or say, but he searched for the right words to speak, or the right thing to do. Takashi found himself doing something he didn't expect of himself. A light-hearted laugh bubbled from deep within his chest, and the sound filled the room as soon as it hit the air. He laughed hard, or at least as hard as he could. His voice was gentle, light on Bokuto's ears. It caused him to open his eyes and look in Akashi's direction, astonished. Those honey-hued eyes took in all that they could of Akashi's laughing face. The way his lips curled up at the corners, the way his eyes squinted enough just so that a glint of green could be seen. Bokuto captured it all, and in no time he found himself laughing too. It was a quiet laugh, so weak it was so weak and feeble it could barely be heard, but it was there, and Akashi could hear it. So that was enough for Bokuto. His face still wore the same shade of red, but he no longer minded this. He was happy he was happy where he was. He was happy that he'd admitted those words. He was glad that Akashi found company in him. Finding a breath between his laughter, Akashi managed to speak. You're ridiculous, he said lightheartedly, his fingers trembling around his phone. Bokuto gave him a look that could only be read as, I am, aren't I? Slowly, Akashi's laughed eased into a chuckle, and as he sat there in his seat, he looked down at Bokuto with placid eyes, a genuine expression that made its home on Akashi's features, and a hand reached up to push through his raven locks. Thank you, Kotaro, he whispered softly, his voice shaking in his throat. He reached a hand out and found Bokuto's. Bokuto tightened his grasp in that automatic way he always did. He stared up at Akashi with a smile that never seemed to fade. His eyes read, You're welcome, Keiji. February 2nd. What time is it? Akashi stirred in bed slightly and let out a weak grunt. He didn't bother to check. He didn't care. The sky was already black. He figured it was already past 5 in the afternoon, so he didn't care anymore. He didn't care if it was 7 at night, or 8 at night, or 12 in the morning, or if world's clock stopped moving altogether. All he cared about was the fact that Bokuto was still with him, next to him, breathing, alive. All he cared about was the fact that Bokuto Kotaro was still there. Akashi moved his head to the side and touched his forehead to Bokuto's neck. Bokuto's movements were late to this, but he reacted nonetheless as he turned Akashi's way to touch his chin to the top of his head. The soft touch of Akashi's hair against his chin comforted Bokuto and pulled him into a relaxed state. Akashi liked it when this happened. It would cause less spasms to grip Bokuto's body, allowing him to unwind more than he usually could. Akashi didn't know why he had this effect on him, but he did, and that was all that mattered to him. The day was exceptionally cold, but Akashi was glad to know that the hospital's room provided enough heat to keep Bokuto from freezing over. But even so, Bokuto still suffered from trembling spells, and they would come in small, short bursts and last only several seconds before his body became too weak to keep it up. Akashi always made sure to hold Bokuto close and squeeze him tight whenever this happened, just to let him know that he was there for him, that he wasn't another one of those illusions that his mind would create. Akashi would also murmur quiet things for him quiet things to him from time to time, to keep a small, often one-sided conversation. He'd usually ask yes or no questions, ones that were easy for Bokuto to answer with a nod or a shake of the head. But sometimes he wouldn't answer certain questions, despite Akashi asking them twice. He wouldn't always get answers. Akashi was aware of this, but he would still ask him things. At other times, he would just tell him things that were on his mind. It was strange how the less Bokuto asked, the more Akashi found himself saying. Relaxing his head against the crook of Bokuto's neck, Akashi blinked wearily and stared off into the distance. He focused on nothing, something he remembered Kenma doing. His hand held one onto one of Bokuto's very thin arms, and his thumb would occasionally rub up and down to comfort him. They shared the same navy blue knit blanket and huddled beneath it, keeping each other warm in the best way they could. As Akashi lay there, quiet, listening to Bokuto's strained breathing, he opened his mouth to speak. He spoke just loudly in Kotaro. He spoke just loudly enough for Bokuto to hear him. He felt him move against his head in response. So he continued. He drew in a deep breath and blinked away at the stinging in his eyes. I want you to know that I don't regret meeting you. Bokuto didn't move much. He just breathed now. I am very happy to have met you and to have gotten to know you. Akashi paused for a long moment and said nothing for a while. But then he spoke up again. So, thank you, Kotaro, for talking to me in the hallway that day and asking me if I was all right. Because I wasn't then, but I am now. Slipping his head down to Bokuto's chest, Akashi leaned in his frail frame. Akashi listened to the quickened rate of Bokuto's still beating heart and knew that this was his response to his words. Akashi closed his eyes again against him, and he found he had nothing more to say. He insist, he instead allowed his actions to speak for him. He pulled himself closer to Bokuto and nudged his face into the warmth of his neck. He could feel Bokuto's chin rubbing against the top of his head, like it always did. It never failed to comfort Akashi. He breathed in that familiar scent that he'd grown so attached to, then exhaled quietly against Bokuto's prominent collarbone. Akashi could feel the weak, ailing arm pull itself to rest upon his shoulder. To this, he shifted in closer and allowed his body to relax. His breathing even his breathing evened out, and in no time he could feel himself slipping slowly into the warm grasp of sleep, unable to resist. In a daze, Akashi's last words were, "Good night, Kotaro," before he slipped off into a deep sleep. He dreamt nothing in particular that night. He suffered no nightmares, nor did he see anything remotely close to a dream. There was nothing. There was only blackness. Kashi woke up to the feeling of sunlight against his face. It was warm on him, certainly something that one would find comforting, but as he stared in bed, he was certain that something was off. He kept his eyes half lidded and his movements reserved, clinging onto the false hope that Bokuto wasn't moving because he didn't want to wake him. But Akashi knew that this wasn't the case. He just didn't want to accept it. Stretching out a trembling arm, Akashi took hold of Bokuto's hand. He shut his eyes and squeezed his palm. It was cold. His hands trembled harder with each passing second, as if the moment would cause Bokuto to wake up. Akashi's face buried into the crook of his neck. He nudged the bridge of his nose against the cool skin. His lips brushed against his collarbone in desperate search of that familiar warmth. Both hands had clasped around Bokuto's own now, quite quivering without pause. He couldn't find his pulse. Devastation weighed down on Akashi in that instant. It was a surreal feeling, one that he could never in a million years describe. It squeezed him, threatening to crush him from the inside out. The pain seared itself into his soul, hindering him, rendering him speechless to a point where he no longer knew what words were. A sob wrenched its way out from Akashi's throat. He desperately tried to hold it in. He tried so hard to keep himself together, but he knew he was too weak to pull such a bluff. Once the second sob had left him, he felt himself spiraling. There was no hiding it. He was undone. His body jerked with each shove that was torn from him, his frame curling to bring himself closer. He held his face against the corpse's neck, just beneath the jawline, breathing in all that was left of Bokuto. He had so many things he'd wanted to do with him, so many things he'd wanted to say, but all of those things seemed to have fallen away once the moment had finally come. Akashi wanted to scream, but he couldn't find his voice. Not even a sentence could get past his suffering. He kept himself against Bokuto and held on to him with what little strength he had left in him. He didn't get up to alert the nurses or the doctors or anyone in the hospital. He knew that once they found out, they would take Bokuto away from him. So he stayed there, holding on to Bokuto, picking his company for one last time before he'd never see him again. Once Akashi left the hospital, he never looked back. He walked home that day with a balled up blanket in his arms, a burgundy scarf around his neck, and nothing more from the hospital. He held them against his frame in the 20th degree weather, and though many people gave him strange looks and watched him sideways, none of this affected him in the slightest. Cold was no longer a factor to Akashi. He couldn't feel it. His mind wouldn't allow him to. He made it home without so much as a hello to his parents who sat in the living room. They asked him questions. He answered blatantly. They asked him about the blanket and the scarf, but they never asked about Bokuto. Akashi was glad. It was a good idea to have never told them about him after all. He ascended the steps to his room, pulled his no, Bokuto's blanket into a lump, and dropped it onto his bed along with the scarf. He reached into his pockets to fish out his phone, and pushed call on one of his contacts. He held it up to his ear and waited for the other line to pick up. Once it did, Akashi was greeted with a hello. Akashi hesitated. He swallowed thickly and looked out the window. Hello? Kuro? It's Akashi. Are you busy? Kuro's voice was reserved and reluctant. No, I'm not. If it isn't much trouble, may I come over? Kuro was quiet on the other end. He already knew. He inhaled inaudibly, and Akashi could hear a scratching sound. After a moment, he finally spoke. His voice was solemn. Sure. Akashi sat at the edge of Kuro's bed, and he stared out the window without focus. Kuro spoke to him, and Akashi listened and often responded. But most of the time, he only sat there and continued to watch nothing. Kuro would have Kuro would have been concerned if not for finding out what had happened earlier that day. He was much like Akashi, sitting on the same side of the bed, a good distance apart from his visitor. Those yellow eyes of his would often dart to the floor, and then to the ceiling, around the room, and back to the floor, but he would never look at Akashi. He feared that if he did, he wouldn't be able to keep his emotions at bay. How did he look? Kuro asked with a hushed tone. It took Akashi a while to respond. When I woke up? Yeah. Kuro looked down. Akashi let out a half-assed grunt and continued to stare forward. Pale, sick, dead. How did you find out he wasn't there anymore? His entire body was relaxed. His head rested on mine with the weight of someone who's unconscious. At this time, Kuro was the one to grunt, the sound coming from deep within his chest. He was low to speak again, but be it either way. Are you going to his funeral? No. Then Akashi came so much. The answer came so much more quickly than Kuro thought it would. It shocked him as Akashi continued. I refuse to go. My last memory of Bokuto will not be of him sharply dressed, pale, stiff, and stuffed in a casket, surrounded by countless amount of people who did not care about him at all until the day they heard about his death. That my last memory of Kotaro is already with me, and it will die along with me. Akashi's tone was monotonous, but Kuro didn't fail to detect the venom that lined each word prior to his last sentence. He understood where Akashi was coming from, and didn't even think of holding his icy tone against him. Kuro was just as bitter. He too did not intend of showing up to any funeral. He'd be furious with everyone in there, and he knew that the same pain burned within Akashi too. Kuro leaned forward and joined his hands together. He stared at the wall and bounced one leg up and down as his emotions slowly started to reclaim him. You know, um, he looked down and rubbed his neck roughly, leaving behind deep red marks. Bokuto, he really um, he really cared about you. He talked about you all the time when he first met. Don't. Kuro froze, his hand clinging to his neck. He slowly looked up to find that Akashi was staring back at him with vacant eyes, void of all known emotion. Don't, Kuro, just don't. He swallowed thick and turned his head to stare out the window again. Akashi laced his fingers together and dug his nails into the back of his hands. He was redirecting the pain. Sorry. It was the last word Kuro murmured before he stared forward as well, having nothing more to say. They shared each other's company in silence for what felt like length of 5 minutes, and in that time, Akashi never looked to the side to catch a glimpse at Kuro. It wasn't until he watched Kuro's form double over in his peripheral that Akashi did glance in his direction. But when he did, he was greeted by a quietly sobbing Kuro, his face having been buried in the palms of his hands. Though, thought, though it was delayed, Akashi moved on instinct and sat near Kuro. He placed his hand on his broad back and rubbed gently, hoping to comfort him and to be the stronger one of the two. But as each second passed, Akashi could feel his own pale pain building up more and more within him. He wished he could fight it, but he knew there was no possible way for him to. It wasn't long before Akashi in his head leaned his head on Kuro's shoulder, as he too fell victim to the sorrow that ate him alive. It had been 3 days since Bokuto's passing, and surely enough, sleep did not come to Akashi as easily as it used to. In the span of those 3 days, he had only acquired a little over 4 hours of sleep in total. On the first night out of the three, Akashi flat out refused to get any rest in fear of suffering another night terror. But during the other 2 nights, he surely did make the effort to try and lull himself to sleep. But each time he did, he either found himself stirring awake from a strange dream, or lying wide awake in the middle of the night, half expecting to receive a message from Bokuto. At times, Akashi would look through the conversations that he'd shared with him. He'd scrolled up, up until the first text, and would scroll all the way down again, waiting for the ellipse to appear on the lower left side of the screen. But always, he'd received nothing. That night was no different, as Akashi repeated this action for the 20th time that day, his thumb scrolling up and down for minutes on end until he finally came to a stop. He had, however, instead of shutting his phone off and trying to force a few hours of sleep upon himself, Akashi stared at the phone screen longingly, and read the last messages that were sent between them. Bokuto send 12:15 a.m. December 20th. Hey, Akashi, are you awake? Akashi, yes, I am. What is it? Bokuto, I'm excited for you to come over tomorrow. Akashi, I visit you every day though. I know, you never miss a day. Don't your parents ask why you come over here so much? Akashi, they think I'm interning, so they don't mind. Oh, works for me. I would hope so. It works for me as well. I'll be sure to bring my laptop when I visit. We can watch Cloud Atlas again. Yes, please. Thank you, Akashi. December 20th, 3:45 a.m. You probably fell asleep. Sorry for always missing you so late. Sleep well, Akashi. I'll see you soon. Akashi frowned and felt a familiar pain pierce his chest. He reread, Sleep well, Akashi, and inhaled great, greatly. I'm trying. He couldn't bring himself to read over the last four words of text again and ultimately shut off his phone. He placed it on the counter near his bedside and buried himself into the blanket that he had so openly shared with Bokuto. Akashi inhaled deeply and closed his eyes, his eyebrows knitting together as his brow creased. It still smelled like him. Akashi relaxed himself against his mattress and closed his eyes, a powerless yawn leaving him. His head eased into his pillow, and to his surprise, within a matter of minutes, he could feel himself sleeping. It felt strange not falling asleep against Bokuto's body, but Akashi knew that he would have to get used to this form of sleeping by his lonesome again. He just hoped that the night wouldn't bring him any malevolent dreams, and all he waited was to see Bokuto again, even if just for a second. An exhausted breath left him, and Akashi finally fell asleep. That night, he dreamed of the first night Bokuto had come over to his home. He dreamt of how Bokuto had buried himself into the navy blue blanket to watch the movie that played on the laptop screen, and how he held Bokuto in his arms that night to aid him in his attempt to sleep. He could still remember the small details, like how Bokuto's starry shirt would slip off his shoulders every so often when he stirred in bed, and how the feel of Bokuto's weight on him would take his breath away. Akashi could still feel the sensation of his wild white and black hair brushing against his cheek whenever he moved, and the warmth that came from him when he held him close. It was all still there, but there was something different about it that puzzled Akashi. At one point in his dream, Akashi looked out the window. The night sky had suddenly become a pale blue, and the warm orange glow of the sun slowly spread across the horizon. He turned his head slowly to look at Bokuto, and watched him as he lay in his arms. Akashi said his name, and to this, Bokuto stirred awake. He turned his head and met Akashi's gaze with weary, well-rested eyes. He stretched and stifled a yawn, pushed a hand through the mess that was his hair, and relaxed his head against Akashi's shoulder. So, sunlight broke into the room, cascading all along the walls and floor, and casting shadows all around. It lit Bokuto's face up just enough for Akashi to take in those healthy features that were staring back at him. He felt his heart rate accelerate, and his throat tightened as his vision blurred. Bokuto beamed at him with a smile that spoke a thousand words, and his hand reached out to touch Akashi's cheek. Akashi felt his palm, warm, full, caressing the round of his face. He leaned into the touch, and his vision began to fade, his eyes welling with tears. Bokuto leaned in and touched his forehead to Akashi's. He was only a blurred shape now, but Akashi knew that he was still there. Bokuto spoke, his voice peaceful, healthy, cold. I found you. A trembling, tender laugh escaped Akashi. He smiled. You found me. And so that's it. That's In Another Life by the great. I forgot their name. Give me a second. I want to credit this by the great Little Lux Ray. I I'm pretty sure it did sound like I was crying at some point. I wouldn't be surprised if it happened. But yeah, that was the fanfic. I I hope you guys liked it. It's I'm sorry for all the errors I had. I hope they weren't like that distracting. Again, the the link is there if you want to read it on your own. Uh yeah, it's a heavy hitter for me. I In general, I believe this is a hard hitting mm, fanfic. So yeah, damn, it took 3 hours to read, but I hope it was worth it. I hope you guys enjoyed. I had a lot of fun. I don't think I'll be able to speak tomorrow when I have school, but hey, it was fun. I'm gonna go cry now. Thank you for joining. I'm gonna see if a friend is streaming. No one's streaming. Oh, Selbit is streaming. No one I know is streaming, so I'm just gonna leave it like that. Thank you for joining me. I hope you guys enjoyed the fanfic. In Another Life by Light, oh, Little Lux Ray. Uh, I'll see you next week. Thank you for joining me. Good night. Bye bye.